When Jacob Hollis opened his cabin door that frozen Wyoming night in 1876, he expected death, not deliverance. His infant daughter had been starving for 4 days, her cries growing weaker with each passing hour. The woman standing in the blizzard was soaked to the bone, desperate for shelter. But beneath her drenched cloak, her body held the one thing his dying baby needed: mother's milk. What happened next would scandalize an entire town and save 3 broken souls. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that swept across Iron Ridge that December carried the kind of cold that didn't just chill a man, it threatened to hollow him out entirely, leaving nothing but a frozen shell where warmth and hope used to live. Jacob Hollis had felt that wind before, had weathered Wyoming storms that buried livestock and froze water troughs solid, but he'd never felt it cut so deep as it did now, sitting alone in his cabin with a dying baby in his arms. The kerosene lamp flickered on the rough-hewn table, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the log walls. Outside, the December blizzard of 1876 hammered against the shutters with fists of ice and fury. Inside, the only sound louder than the storm was the pitiful, weakening cry of 10-week-old Emma Hollis, a sound that was tearing her father apart one heartbeat at a time. Jacob rocked the infant mechanically, his calloused rancher's hands enormous against her tiny, fragile body. 4 days. 4 days since she'd taken more than a few desperate sips from the bottles he'd tried. 4 days of watching her little face grow more drawn, her skin losing that healthy pink glow all babies should have. 4 days of helpless, creeping terror as he watched his daughter, the last living piece of his beloved Sarah, slowly starved to death in his arms. "Come on, little one," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and unshed tears. "Just a little. Please, Emma. Please." He pressed the bottle to her lips again, goat's milk this time, warmed by the fire, thinned with a little water the way old Doc Morrison had suggested before the snows made the 15-mile ride to Sage Hollow impossible. The baby's mouth moved weakly against the rubber nipple, but she didn't suck, didn't swallow. She just cried, a thin, reedy sound that seemed to echo the emptiness inside Jacob's chest. Sarah had been gone 32 days. 32 days since the fever had taken her, since he'd buried her on the hillside overlooking the valley she'd loved, since he'd stood over her grave with Emma wrapped in blankets and promised his dying wife that he'd keep their baby safe, that he'd find a way. He was breaking that promise, breaking it as surely as the winter was breaking over the land. The cabin that had once been filled with Sarah's laughter and the smell of her cooking now felt like a tomb. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin. The stove held only the embers of a fire Jacob barely remembered to tend. His own face, reflected in the dark window glass, looked gaunt and wild. Beard untrimmed, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, hair standing in directions he didn't care to fix. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the failing life in his arms. He'd tried everything. Everything he could think of. Everything the few neighbors within riding distance had suggested before the worst of the winter storms had isolated Iron Ridge completely. Goat's milk from old Betsy in the barn. Cow's milk brought by the Hendersons from their ranch 8 miles south. Honey water, sugar water. Weak broths strained so thin they were barely more than flavored liquid. Emma had rejected them all. Her tiny body knew what it needed, what only a mother could provide, and nothing else would do. Jacob rose from the rocking chair, pacing the small cabin with Emma against his shoulder, bouncing her gently the way Sarah used to do. The motion was automatic now, a desperate habit born of 4 days without sleep, without hope, without any idea what to do next except keep moving, keep trying, keep fighting the inevitable. "Your mama," he whispered into Emma's downy hair. "Your mama would know what to do. She'd know how to fix this. She always knew, little one. She always—" His voice broke. He pressed his face against the baby's head, feeling her warmth, her fragility, the terrible lightness of a child who wasn't getting enough to eat. When had she last had a full diaper? Yesterday? The day before? He couldn't remember, couldn't think straight anymore. The clock on the mantel, Sarah's grandmother's clock, brought all the way from Pennsylvania, chimed 10 times. 10 o'clock at night, and Jacob was alone with a dying baby in a storm that showed no signs of letting up. The wind shrieked around the cabin's corners, finding every gap in the chinking, every weakness in the structure, probing like it wanted to get inside and finish what grief and helplessness had started. He thought of the sign he'd nailed to the gatepost 4 days ago, after the last neighbor had ridden away shaking his head, saying he was sorry, so sorry, but there was nothing more to be done except pray and hope for a miracle. Jacob had taken a piece of board, painted it with shaking hands. Infant hungry. Need milk. Please help. It seemed pathetic now, foolish. Who would see it out here? Iron Ridge was 15 miles from Sage Hollow, the nearest real town. The ranch sat at the end of a rough track that most folks avoided even in good weather. In a blizzard like this, the sign might as well have been on the moon, but he'd nailed it up anyway, because doing nothing would have driven him mad faster than false hope ever could. Emma's crying had weakened to a whimper. Jacob looked down at her scrunched face, at the little fist that waved weakly, and felt something inside him start to crack. Not break. It had already broken when Sarah died. This was deeper, more fundamental. This was the sound of a man's soul beginning to shatter. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "Baby girl, I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to do. I don't know how to save you." The fire in the stove popped, making him flinch. He needed to add more wood, keep the cabin warm, but he couldn't bring himself to put Emma down. Couldn't let her go even for a minute. If these were her last hours, God, please no, but if they were, he wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that her papa was here, holding her, loving her, even if he couldn't give her what she needed. He sank back into the rocking chair, resuming that mechanical motion that had become his entire existence. Rock. Bounce. Whisper. Repeat. The storm battered the walls. The lamp flickered. Time stretched and warped until Jacob couldn't tell if minutes or hours were passing. Emma's whimpers grew softer. "No," Jacob whispered. "No, baby. Stay with me. Stay with Papa. Please, Emma. Please." And then, cutting through the howl of the wind, through the fog of Jacob's despair, came a sound that made his head snap up. Knock, knock, knock. Frantic, desperate, real. Someone was at the door. Jacob's heart lurched. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't believe it. The storm was too fierce. No one could be out there. No one would be crazy enough to travel in this weather. It had to be his imagination, exhaustion playing tricks on his desperate mind. Knock, knock, knock. Louder now, more insistent. And underneath it, barely audible over the wind, a voice. "Please, please, is anyone there?" A woman's voice. Jacob surged to his feet, Emma still clutched against his chest, and crossed the cabin in 3 long strides. His hand trembled as he threw the bolt and yanked the door open against the force of the wind. The blizzard tried to force its way inside, a wall of white and cold that stole his breath. But in the midst of it, illuminated by the lamplight spilling from the cabin, stood a woman. She was drenched. Her dark cloak hung heavy with ice and snow, plastered to a slim frame that shook with violent shivers. Her hood had fallen back to reveal dark hair matted against a pale face. But it was her eyes that struck Jacob, wide, haunted, filled with a desperation that matched his own. "Please," she gasped, teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "Please, I got lost. The storm. My horse. I just need shelter. Just until—" She swayed, and Jacob realized she was moments from collapse. "Get inside," he commanded, reaching out with his free arm to steady her. "Quickly, before we both freeze." She stumbled across the threshold, and Jacob slammed the door shut behind her, throwing the bolt. The sudden absence of wind made the cabin feel almost silent, broken only by the woman's shuddering breaths and Emma's weak whimpers. The stranger stood in a puddle of melting snow, dripping and shaking. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of her cloak, but they were too numb to work properly. She looked up at Jacob, seemed about to speak, and then her gaze fell on the bundle in his arms. On Emma. Something changed in her face. The desperation shifted, transformed into something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or memory. Her eyes fixed on the baby with an intensity that should have alarmed Jacob, but he was too exhausted, too grateful for another living soul in this cabin of death and despair to question it. "You have a baby," the woman whispered. It wasn't quite a question. "My daughter," Jacob said. His voice came out hoarse. "Emma, she's not well." Even as he said it, Emma let out another thin cry, and the woman flinched as if struck. Her hands, still shaking from cold, rose unconsciously toward the child, then dropped. "How old?" she asked quietly. 10 weeks. Her mother, my wife, died a month ago. And Emma, she won't take a bottle, won't eat. I've tried everything, and she's—" His voice cracked again. "She's dying." The blunt words hung in the air between them. The woman's face had gone even paler, if that was possible. She swayed again, and this time Jacob saw it wasn't just from cold or exhaustion. There was something else in her expression: pain, loss, a grief so deep it matched his own. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair by the stove. "You'll catch your death standing there in wet clothes." She moved like a sleepwalker, crossing to the chair and sinking into it. Her cloak fell open, and Jacob saw that her dress beneath was equally soaked. He should find her something dry to wear, something of Sarah's perhaps, but he couldn't seem to make his body move. He just stood there, holding his dying daughter, staring at this stranger who'd appeared out of the storm like an answer to a prayer he'd been too hopeless to speak. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Abigail." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Abigail Rowe." "I'm Jacob Hollis. This is my ranch, Iron Ridge." She nodded slowly, not really looking at him. Her eyes were still fixed on Emma with that strange, painful intensity. "I was traveling to Sage Hollow, to my sister's place. But the storm came up so fast and my horse spooked, threw me, ran off. I walked for, I don't know, hours maybe. I saw your light." "You're lucky you found us," Jacob said. Then, with a bitter laugh, "Though I'm not sure luck's the right word, this place isn't exactly a haven right now." Abigail's gaze finally lifted to his face. In the lamplight, he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps mid-20s, around Sarah's age. Pretty, probably, when she wasn't half-frozen and hollow-eyed with exhaustion. But it was the grief in those eyes that caught him, held him. It was a grief he recognized, intimate as his own reflection. "You said she won't eat," Abigail said slowly. "Your daughter. Nothing I give her is right. She needs—" He stopped, unable to say it, unable to admit that what Emma needed was impossible, was buried on a hillside, was gone forever. "She needs her mother," Abigail finished softly. Jacob nodded, his throat too tight for words. The silence that fell then was broken only by the crackling fire and the storm's endless assault on the cabin walls. Abigail sat perfectly still in the chair, her wet cloak dripping, her hands clutched together in her lap. She was shaking, whether from cold or something else, Jacob couldn't tell. Then Emma let out another cry, weaker than before, and Abigail made a sound, a small, broken noise that might have been a sob or might have been something else entirely. "May I—" she started, then stopped, swallowed hard. "May I see her?" Jacob hesitated. There was something almost frightening in the woman's intensity, something that set off warning bells even through his exhaustion. But Emma was dying. What harm could looking do? He moved closer to the chair, angling Emma so Abigail could see her face. The baby's eyes were closed, her tiny features scrunched in discomfort and hunger. Her lips moved weakly, still seeking what she couldn't find. Abigail stared at Emma for a long moment. Then very slowly she raised one trembling hand and touched the baby's cheek with a single finger. The touch was feather-light, reverent, heartbreaking in its gentleness. "She's beautiful," Abigail whispered. A tear slid down her face, cutting a clean track through the grime and melted snow. "She's so beautiful." "She looks like her mother," Jacob said. His own voice was thick now, unsteady. "Sarah, my wife. She had that same... He couldn't finish. Abigail nodded as if she understood. And then, as Jacob watched, something extraordinary happened. A dark stain began to spread across the front of Abigail's wet dress. At first, Jacob didn't understand what he was seeing, but as the stain grew, spreading outward from her chest, realization hit him like a physical blow. Milk. Abigail's body was producing milk. She looked down at herself, at the wetness seeping through her dress, and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Her hands flew to her chest, pressing against the dampness. And when she looked up at Jacob, her face was a mask of anguish and desperate hope. "I had a baby," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. A boy. Thomas. He was 3 months old when the fever took him. That was 4 months ago. 4 months, and my body I still... She broke off, sobbing now, her whole body shaking with more than cold. I tried to stop it. I tried binding my chest, taking herbs, everything the doctor said, but it wouldn't stop. Like my body doesn't know he's gone. Like it's still waiting for him to... Her voice dissolved into inarticulate grief, and Jacob stood frozen, Emma in his arms, his mind racing. A baby. She'd lost her baby. And her body was still producing milk, was still trying to feed a child who would never need feeding again. The signs had been there if he'd been clear-headed enough to see them. The way she'd stared at Emma, the pain in her eyes, the tender touch. She was a mother without a child. And Emma was a child without a mother. Jacob's heart began to pound. It was impossible. Insane. He'd never heard of such a thing. A woman nursing another woman's child. A stranger's child. It was too intimate, too strange. What would people say? What would... Emma let out a sound that barely qualified as a cry, so weak it was almost not there at all. And Jacob made his decision. Abigail, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. Abigail, look at me. She raised her tear-streaked face, eyes wide and lost. Can you... He swallowed hard. Would you be willing to feed her, to nurse her? The question hung in the air between them, enormous and impossible and desperate. Abigail stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without sound. More tears spilled down her cheeks. Her hands, still pressed against her leaking chest, trembled violently. I don't know if I can, she whispered. Thomas was so small I don't know if there's enough, if it would... Please, Jacob said. He took a step closer and then another, until he was standing right in front of her chair. Please, Abigail, she's dying. I've tried everything, and she's dying, and I can't lose her too. I can't. If there's any chance at all... He stopped, his composure finally breaking completely. Please, save my daughter. Abigail looked from Jacob's face to Emma's, then back again. Something was happening behind her eyes. Some internal struggle, some battle between fear and hope, and grief and desperate, aching need. Jacob could see it all playing out in her expression, and he held his breath, praying to a God he'd stopped believing in a month ago, begging for a miracle he had no right to expect. Then slowly, Abigail reached up and began to unbutton her dress with shaking fingers. Yes, she whispered. Yes, give her to me. Jacob's hands were shaking as badly as hers as he lowered Emma into Abigail's waiting arms. The baby felt so light, so fragile, and for a moment he couldn't let go, couldn't release her to this stranger, but Abigail's arms were already there, supporting Emma's head with practiced ease, positioning her with the sureness of a woman who'd done this before, who remembered how. It's all right, Abigail murmured, though Jacob wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to Emma or to herself. It's all right, sweet girl. You're all right now. She'd managed to open her dress and chemise enough to expose her breast. Even in his desperation, Jacob felt he should look away, should give her privacy, but he couldn't. He couldn't tear his eyes away from his daughter, from this impossible moment. Abigail brought Emma to her breast, guiding the baby's mouth with gentle fingers. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Emma's lips brushed against Abigail's nipple, moved weakly, and Jacob felt his hopes start to crumble. It wasn't going to work. Emma was too far gone, too weak. And then Emma latched. The change was instantaneous. The baby's mouth closed around Abigail's nipple, and suddenly she was sucking, really, truly sucking, with a strength and determination Jacob hadn't seen in days. He could see her throat working, swallowing, taking in the milk her body so desperately needed. Abigail let out a gasp that was half sob, half laugh. Her free hand came up to cup Emma's head, fingers threading through the baby's fine hair. Tears were streaming down her face now, falling onto Emma's blanket. But she was smiling, actually smiling, even as she cried. Oh, she breathed. Oh, sweetheart. There you go. There you go. Jacob stood transfixed, watching this impossible, beautiful thing unfold before him. The cabin was still cold. The storm still raged outside. Everything that had been wrong with the world was still wrong. But in this moment, in this small circle of lamplight, something was being made right. Emma nursed with the fierce concentration of the starving. Her tiny hands came up to rest against Abigail's breast, kneading gently the way all nursing babies do, some instinct older than memory. Abigail was crying harder now, her whole body shaking with sobs, but she held Emma steady, held her close, and whispered words Jacob couldn't quite hear, words that might have been for Emma, or might have been for the son she'd lost, or might have been for all the broken things in the world that sometimes, miraculously, found ways to heal. Jacob felt his own tears start to fall. He'd been holding them back for days, for weeks, for the entire month since Sarah died. He'd told himself he had to be strong, had to hold it together for Emma's sake. But watching his daughter feed, really feed, for the first time in 4 agonizing days, watching this stranger give life to his child out of her own grief and loss, the dam finally broke. He sank to his knees beside the chair, one hand coming up to rest on Emma's back, feeling her breathe, feeling her live. His other hand found Abigail's arm, gripping it perhaps too tightly, but he couldn't help it, couldn't let go. "Thank you," he choked out. "Thank you, thank you." Abigail turned her tear-stained face toward him, and for the first time since she'd stumbled into his cabin, she truly smiled. It was a broken, grief-soaked smile, but it was real. "Thank you," she whispered back. "You don't understand. I thought I'd never—" Her voice failed, but she didn't need to finish. Jacob understood. He understood that she'd lost her purpose when she lost her son, that her body's refusal to stop producing milk had been both a torture and a lifeline, keeping her connected to a child she'd never hold again. And now, in the midst of a blizzard, in a stranger's cabin, she'd found a reason for that continued connection. A child who needed what her body still, stubbornly, providentially produced. They stayed like that for a long time, Jacob kneeling, Abigail in the chair, Emma nursing between them while the storm tried and failed to tear down the walls. The fire crackled, the lamp burned steady, and slowly, so slowly Jacob almost didn't notice it happening, the terrible tension that had held him rigid for 4 days began to ease. Emma's eyes had drifted closed. Her suckling had slowed from desperate to contented, the rhythm of a baby who was finally getting what she needed. Her little fists relaxed against Abigail's skin, no longer clutching, but simply resting, trusting. "She's falling asleep," Abigail murmured. There was wonder in her voice and something like peace. "When did she last sleep like this?" Jacob asked. "Really sleep?" "Before Sarah died," Jacob admitted. "She's been fitful, crying. She knew something was wrong." "Babies know," Abigail said softly. "They always know." They fell silent again. Jacob's knees were starting to ache from kneeling on the hard floor, but he didn't want to move, didn't want to disturb this fragile moment. Outside, the wind seemed to have lessened slightly, or maybe he was just so focused on the scene before him that everything else had faded to background noise. Finally, reluctantly, he cleared his throat. You're still soaked through. You need to get out of those wet clothes. Get warm. I can find you something dry to wear." Abigail nodded but didn't move. She was looking down at Emma with an expression Jacob recognized, the look every mother wore when watching her baby sleep. Tender, protective, filled with a love that transcended explanation. Except Emma wasn't her baby. She was a stranger's child, fed out of necessity and desperate circumstance. But looking at Abigail's face, Jacob wasn't sure she remembered that distinction anymore. "I'll be right back," he said, rising stiffly to his feet. His legs had gone numb, and he had to grab the chair back to steady himself. "I'll get you some of my wife's things. They should fit well enough." He moved to the small trunk in the corner where Sarah's clothes were stored. He hadn't opened it since the funeral, had been unable to face the task of sorting through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to give away. Now he lifted the lid with trembling hands, and Sarah's scent rose to meet him. Lavender and fresh air and something uniquely her. His vision blurred, but he blinked the tears back and reached for the first dress his hand found. A simple wool dress, dark blue, practical. Sarah had worn it for working around the ranch. It would be warm, which was the most important thing right now. He also grabbed a heavy shawl and some underthings, trying not to think too hard about the intimacy of handling women's garments, of offering them to a stranger. Everything about this situation was strange, improper, Impossible. But Emma was nursing. Emma was alive. That made everything else irrelevant. When he turned back, Abigail had shifted Emma to her other breast. The baby was still nursing, though more slowly now, drifting toward sleep. Abigail looked up at Jacob's approach, and he saw exhaustion etched deep in her features. "How long since you've slept?" he asked, setting the clothes on the table. She had to think about it. 2 days, maybe? "I left my sister's place 2 days ago. Planned to be in Sage Hollow by nightfall, but the storm—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I should have stayed put. Should have waited for the weather to clear. But I needed to get away. Couldn't stay in that house another minute." Jacob understood that too. After Sarah died, he'd thrown himself into ranch work until his body screamed for rest, anything to avoid sitting still with his grief. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "The storm's too bad to go anywhere anyway. Tomorrow, if it clears, I can ride you to Sage Hollow or back to your sister's, whichever you prefer." "I can't impose—" "You saved my daughter's life," Jacob interrupted. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You can impose all you want." Abigail smiled faintly at that. Emma had finally stopped nursing, her mouth falling open in the complete relaxation of deep sleep. Milk dribbled from the corner of her lips, and Abigail wiped it gently with her finger. "She's beautiful," Abigail said again. "You said she looks like her mother?" "The spitting image," Jacob confirmed. "Sarah had that same dark hair, same little nose. Emma's eyes are mine, though, gray instead of brown." "Tell me about her," Abigail said softly. "About Sarah." Jacob opened his mouth to deflect, to say it was too hard, too raw. But something in Abigail's face stopped him. She'd shared her grief with him, had literally given of her own body to save his child. The least he could do was share his memories. So he did. He told her about meeting Sarah at a church social in Sage Hollow 7 years ago, how she'd been new to town, just arrived from Pennsylvania to teach at the schoolhouse. He told her about their courtship, about building this cabin with his own hands as a wedding gift. He told her about the early years of their marriage, the struggles of starting a ranch from nothing, the joy of finally prospering enough to think about starting a family. And he told her about Emma's birth, about Sarah's difficult labor, about the fever that had seemed minor at first but had turned deadly within days, about holding his wife's hand as she slipped away, about her last words, "Take care of our girl. Promise me, Jacob. Promise." By the time he finished, his voice was hoarse, and Abigail's cheeks were wet with tears again. Emma slept on, oblivious, held secure in the arms of a woman who'd been a stranger an hour ago. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Abigail said. "She was everything," Jacob replied simply. They sat in silence for a moment, sharing the particular communion of the bereaved, people who understood that some losses created holes in the world that could never be filled, only learned to be navigated around. "You should change," Jacob said finally, nodding toward the dry clothes. "Get warm. I can take Emma while you—" But when he reached for the baby, Abigail's arms tightened almost imperceptibly. She caught herself immediately, loosening her hold, but Jacob had seen the instinctive reaction. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean, it's all right," Jacob said. And surprisingly, he meant it. He understood what it was to need to hold something precious, to be afraid of letting go. "Keep her, at least until you're ready." Relief flooded Abigail's face. She adjusted Emma in her arms, cradling her more comfortably. "I'll need to change eventually, before I freeze." "The bedroom's through that door," Jacob said, pointing. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep out here, keep the fire going." "I can't take your bed. You're feeding my daughter," Jacob said flatly. "You're taking the bed." Abigail looked like she wanted to argue further, but another shiver ran through her and she nodded. "All right, thank you." She rose carefully, moving slowly so as not to disturb Emma. Jacob watched as she carried his daughter toward the bedroom, and something in his chest clenched at the sight. This stranger holding his child like she was her own, moving with the natural grace of motherhood toward a room that had been empty since Sarah died. He told himself it was just necessity, just circumstance, just a storm-brought miracle that would end when the weather cleared and Abigail went on her way to Sage Hollow. But even then, some part of him knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Nothing about love, about loss, about healing, about the strange ways life knitted itself back together was ever simple. The bedroom door closed softly behind Abigail, and Jacob stood alone in the main room, listening to the muffled sounds of her moving about, the rustle of wet fabric being removed, the quiet creak of the bed frame, the whisper of dry cloth being pulled over cold skin. He turned away, giving her what privacy he could in a cabin where walls were thin and every sound carried, and busied himself building up the fire in the stove. His hands moved automatically, feeding split logs into the firebox, adjusting the damper, but his mind was elsewhere. On the woman in his bedroom holding his daughter, on the impossibility of the last hour, on the fact that Emma had nursed, really nursed, and was now sleeping the deep, peaceful sleep of a satisfied baby instead of the fitful, hungry doze that had terrified him for 4 straight days. She was going to live. His daughter was going to live. The weight of that realization hit him all at once, and Jacob had to grip the edge of the stove to steady himself. His legs felt weak, his chest tight. For 4 days he'd been preparing himself for the worst, building walls around his heart to protect what little was left of it when the inevitable happened. Now those walls were crumbling, and he didn't know whether to laugh or weep or fall to his knees and thank a God he'd cursed just hours ago. He did none of those things. Instead, he straightened up, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and set about making the cabin more livable. The dishes got washed. The table got cleared. He swept the floor, finding Sarah's broom in the corner where he'd left it weeks ago, and the familiar motion of pushing dirt and debris toward the door was oddly soothing. By the time Abigail emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, the cabin looked almost normal again. She'd changed into Sarah's blue dress, which fit her reasonably well despite Abigail being a bit taller and slimmer than his wife had been. Her dark hair, no longer dripping, hung in damp waves past her shoulders. She'd wrapped the shawl around herself, and her feet were bare, her boots presumably still too wet to wear. She was still carrying Emma. "She's still asleep," Abigail said softly, seeing Jacob's gaze on the baby. "I didn't want to put her down. Is that all right?" "Of course," Jacob said. Then, because he could see the uncertainty in her face, "Thank you for everything." Abigail nodded, moving to the rocking chair and settling into it with Emma cradled against her chest. She began to rock slowly, automatically, her hands stroking the baby's back in gentle circles. The motion seemed to calm her as much as it did Emma. "The dress fits well," Jacob observed, not sure what else to say. "Your wife had good taste," Abigail replied. "It's warm, comfortable." An awkward silence fell. Jacob realized he was standing in the middle of his own cabin like a guest, unsure what to do with his hands, where to look, how to navigate this strange new reality. Less than 2 hours ago, he'd been alone with his dying daughter. Now there was a woman in his home, wearing his dead wife's dress, holding his child, and he had no idea what the rules were supposed to be. "You should eat something," he said finally. "You must be starving." "I couldn't." "I'm making food anyway," Jacob interrupted. "You'll eat." It wasn't a question, and Abigail seemed to recognize that arguing would be pointless. She nodded, adjusting her hold on Emma, and watched as Jacob moved to the stove and began pulling out what meager supplies he had left. Bread from 3 days ago, hard but edible if toasted. Some beans he could warm up. A bit of salt pork. Nothing fancy, but it would do. As he worked, he was acutely aware of Abigail's presence behind him. He could hear the creak of the rocking chair, the soft sound of her humming, so quiet he almost missed it, and underneath it all, Emma's peaceful breathing, the sounds of life, of normalcy, of things he'd thought he'd lost forever. "How long were you married?" Abigail asked after a while. Jacob didn't turn from the stove. 7 years. We met when she came to Sage Hollow to teach. I was in town selling cattle, saw her at the church social, and—" He trailed off, remembering. "I knew, right then, that she was going to be my wife." "Was she a good teacher?" "The best. Kids loved her. She had this way of making even the dullest lessons interesting." He flipped the bread in the skillet, watching it brown. "She stopped teaching when we got married, wanted to focus on the ranch, on building a life out here. She always said she'd go back to it someday, maybe open a school closer to home so the ranch children wouldn't have to ride so far." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "What?" "She was." Jacob's throat tightened. "Emma would have loved her. would have learned so much from her, and now she won't even remember. He stopped, unable to continue. The bread was burning. He snatched the skillet off the heat, cursing under his breath, blinking hard against the tears that wanted to come. "She'll know her mother through you," Abigail said quietly. "Through the stories you tell her, the memories you share. That's not nothing, Jacob. That's important." He nodded, not trusting his voice, and focused on scraping the slightly charred bread onto a plate. The beans were warm enough. He dished them out, added a chunk of salt pork, and brought the plate to Abigail along with a fork and a cup of water from the bucket by the door. "It's not much," he apologized. "It's perfect," Abigail said. She looked down at Emma, still sleeping in her arms. "But I can't exactly eat while holding her." "Right. Of course." Jacob reached for the baby. "I'll take her." This time Abigail didn't hesitate, transferring Emma carefully into Jacob's arms. The baby stirred slightly at the movement, made a small sound, then settled back into sleep. Jacob carried her to the cradle he'd placed near the stove, a cradle he'd built himself while Sarah was pregnant, sanding it smooth and carving little flowers into the headboard, because Sarah had loved wildflowers. He laid Emma down gently, tucking the blanket around her, and stood watching her for a moment. Her face was relaxed now, peaceful. The pinched, hungry look that had terrified him was already fading. Her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. She was going to be all right. When he turned back, Abigail was eating with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't realized how hungry she was until food was in front of her. She looked up, caught him watching, and smiled sheepishly. "I'm sorry," she said around a mouthful of bread. "I didn't mean to be rude. It's just, I can't remember when I ate last." "Don't apologize. Eat." She did, making short work of the modest meal while Jacob poured himself coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the stove since morning. It was thick and bitter, but it was hot, and right now that was enough. He sat at the table across from her, cradling the tin cup in both hands, and they fell into a more comfortable silence. Outside, the storm was definitely lessening. The wind no longer screamed quite so loudly, and the snow battering the windows had thinned from a wall of white to something more like heavy flurries. "Tell me about your son," Jacob said. He hadn't planned to ask, but the question came out anyway. "If you want to. If it's not too—" "No," Abigail interrupted. "No, I'd like to. No one asks about him anymore. Like if they don't mention him, I'll forget and then I won't be sad." She laughed, a bitter sound. "As if I could ever forget." She set her fork down, her appetite apparently satisfied, and stared into the middle distance. "Thomas. His name was Thomas, after my father. He was born healthy. Perfect, really. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that could wake the dead when he was hungry." A soft smile crossed her face. "He looked like his father. Dark eyes, serious expression, even as a newborn. My husband used to joke that Thomas came into the world already worried about grown-up things." "Your husband," Jacob said carefully. "Is he—" "Dead," Abigail said flatly. "Mining accident, 2 months before Thomas was born. Cave-in at the silver mine outside Virginia City. They didn't even recover his body." Jacob felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "I'm sorry." "Everyone's sorry," Abigail said, not unkindly. "Sorry doesn't bring anyone back, though, does it?" No, it doesn't." She picked up her fork again, pushing the last of the beans around her plate without eating them. "I was managing somehow. Living with my sister and her husband, trying to figure out how to be a mother alone. And Thomas he was everything. My reason for getting up in the morning, for keeping going when all I wanted to do was curl up and die with my husband." Her voice cracked. She paused, took a breath, continued. "And then the fever came. Same one that took your Sarah, probably. It swept through the area last summer, killed a dozen people, most of them children." She looked up at Jacob, her eyes swimming with tears. "He was fine one day. Laughing, nursing, being perfect, and the next he was burning up, crying in pain, and nothing I did helped. Nothing. 3 days later he was gone." "Abigail. The doctor said my milk was still good, that it hadn't made him sick. But I wondered, I still wonder. What if something was wrong with me? What if I poisoned him somehow?" "You didn't," Jacob said firmly. "Fevers don't work that way, you know that." I know it here, Abigail said, tapping her head. But here, she pressed her hand to her chest. Here, I'm not so sure. Jacob understood that too. The irrational guilt that came with loss. The endless what-ifs that plagued you in the dark hours before dawn. What if he'd gotten the doctor sooner? What if he'd been a better husband? What if? After Thomas died, Abigail continued, my body didn't get the message, kept producing milk, kept getting engorged and painful and leaking. The doctor gave me herbs to dry it up, told me to bind my chest tight. It helped some, but not enough. And part of me didn't want it to stop, because as long as I was still producing milk, it meant some part of him was still with me, still needed me. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Foolish, I know. Not foolish, Jacob said quietly. Human. They sat in silence for a moment, sharing the weight of their respective griefs. Then Abigail straightened up, seeming to shake off the heavy mood. I couldn't stay at my sister's anymore, she said. Elizabeth means well, but she has 3 healthy children and a doting husband, and being around all that happiness was killing me. So I decided to visit my other sister in Sage Hollow. Catherine's unmarried, runs a boarding house. I thought maybe she'd understand better, or at least give me space to breathe. But you didn't make it there. No, the storm came up and I got lost and my horse threw me. She smiled faintly. And I ended up here, with a baby who needed exactly what my body keeps insisting on producing. If I believed in God, I'd call it providence. And you don't believe in God? Abigail's smile turned bitter. I did. Before my husband died. Before Thomas. Now? She shrugged. Now, I don't know what I believe. What about you? Jacob thought about it. I'm angry at him, he admitted, for taking Sarah, for leaving me alone with a baby I didn't know how to save. But tonight, when you knocked on that door, he shook his head. I don't know. Maybe there's something. Or maybe it was just lucky coincidence. Some coincidence, Abigail murmured. From the cradle came a small sound, Emma stirring, not quite waking, but moving toward it. Both adults turned to look at her, and Jacob saw the expression on Abigail's face shift into something tender and yearning. She'll be hungry again soon, Abigail said softly. Babies her age usually nurse every 2 to 3 hours. I know, Sarah used to He stopped, swallowed. I watched her do it. Never thought I'd miss those middle-of-the-night wakings, the exhaustion. But I'd give anything to have her back, tired and milk-stained and complaining about how Emma was using her as a pacifier. Abigail smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. That's what they do. That's what they're supposed to do. Emma's eyes opened, and immediately her face scrunched up in that particular expression that preceded crying. Before Jacob could move, Abigail was already out of her chair and crossing to the cradle. Hello, sweet girl, she murmured, lifting Emma with practiced ease. Are you hungry again? Of course you are. Growing babies are always hungry. She settled back into the rocking chair, and without any self-consciousness now, opened Sarah's dress and guided Emma to her breast. The baby latched immediately, and the cabin filled with the soft sounds of nursing, the quiet suckling, the small, satisfied noises Emma made, the creak of the rocking chair keeping rhythm. Jacob watched from the table, his coffee growing cold in his hands. There was something mesmerizing about the scene, something that made his chest ache in ways he couldn't name. It was right, somehow, natural. A mother and child, even if the biology said otherwise. I should probably stay, Abigail said after a while, not looking up from Emma. At least for a few days, until she's eating well on her own, gaining weight properly, if you'll have me, that is. Jacob's heart lurched. He hadn't wanted to ask, hadn't wanted to presume, but the thought of Abigail leaving, of Emma going back to those bottles she refused, filled him with a terror he couldn't quite suppress. Yes, he said, perhaps too quickly. Yes, please stay. As long as you need to. As long as... He stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. As long as Emma needs you? As long as I need you? As long as this doesn't feel quite so much like we're all drowning? Thank you, Abigail said simply. She looked up at him then, and their eyes met across the small cabin. Something passed between them in that moment, An understanding, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that they were both broken people doing their best to keep each other's pieces from scattering completely. "I should write to my sister," Abigail continued. "Let Catherine know I'm all right, that I've been delayed. When the storm clears, could you—" "I'll ride to Sage Hollow myself," Jacob promised. "Deliver the message. Let her know you're safe." "Thank you." She paused. "What will you tell her about why I'm staying?" It was a good question. What would he tell anyone who asked? The truth seemed impossible to explain, too intimate, too strange. A widow nursing another woman's baby? People would talk, would judge, would make assumptions that might not be fair to either of them. "I'll tell her you were stranded in the storm," Jacob said, "that you're recovering from the journey, and I'm keeping you safe until the weather's fit for travel. That's all true." "But not the whole truth." "No," Jacob admitted, "not the whole truth." Abigail nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "People will find out eventually, about Emma, about me feeding her." "Maybe," Jacob said, "or maybe we keep it between us. You stay here, help with Emma until she's strong enough for bottles again, and then you go to your sister's as planned. No one needs to know the details." Even as he said it, Jacob knew it was naive. Secrets didn't stay secret in places like Iron Ridge and Sage Hollow. Someone would notice. Someone would guess. And then the whispers would start, the judgment, the scandal. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, Emma was nursing. Right now, she was alive and eating and going to survive. Everything else was secondary. The storm continued to die down as night deepened. Jacob banked the fire for the long, cold hours ahead and lit a second lamp, brightening the cabin against the darkness pressing in from outside. Abigail continued to rock Emma, switching breasts when needed, humming softly under her breath. Around midnight, Emma finally fell into deep sleep, her belly full, her body relaxed. Abigail looked down at her with an expression of such profound peace that Jacob felt like an intruder witnessing something private. "I should put her down," Abigail whispered. "Get some sleep myself." "You take the bed," Jacob said, standing. "I'll sleep out here, keep the fire going." "Jacob, I can't—" "You're feeding my daughter," he said firmly. "You need rest, real rest. The bed is yours." Abigail looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion was written in every line of her body. She nodded finally, rising carefully with Emma in her arms. Would you mind if I kept her with me, in case she wakes hungry?" Something in Jacob's chest tightened at the question, at the careful way she asked it, like she expected him to say no, like she expected him to deny her this small thing after everything she'd done. "Of course," he said. "She'll sleep better with you anyway. She's used to—" He stopped. "She's used to sleeping next to her mother." The words hung unspoken in the air between them. Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, carrying Emma like the precious cargo she was, she disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door softly behind her. Jacob stood alone in the main room, listening to the quiet sounds of Abigail settling into bed, the creak of the mattress, the rustle of blankets. Then silence. He sank into the rocking chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. 4 days with almost no sleep, running on fear and desperation and prayer. His body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, his eyes gritty and burning, his mind fuzzy with fatigue. But he couldn't sleep yet, not until he was sure the fire would last through the night, that the cabin would stay warm, that Emma would stay safe. He must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing he knew, pale gray light was filtering through the windows and someone was moving in the cabin. Jacob jerked awake, disoriented, reaching instinctively for Emma before remembering she wasn't there. Abigail stood by the stove, Emma in one arm while she used the other hand to poke at the fire. She'd wrapped a blanket around her shoulders like a shawl, and her hair hung loose down her back. She looked up when she heard Jacob stir, offering him a tentative smile. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to wake you. I was just—" Emma was hungry, and I thought I'd get the fire going again while I fed her. Jacob sat up, wincing as his back protested, sleeping in the chair. "What time is it?" "Near dawn, I think. Maybe 5 o'clock." He'd slept for 5 hours. 5 uninterrupted hours, the longest stretch since Sarah died. His body felt heavy with it, reluctant to fully wake. "How's Emma?" he asked, scrubbing his hands over his face. "Perfect," Abigail said, and there was such warmth in her voice that Jacob looked up sharply. She was gazing down at the baby with unmistakable affection, her fingers stroking Emma's cheek. She nursed twice during the night, went right back to sleep both times. She's gaining strength already. I can feel it. Relief flooded through Jacob so intensely it made him dizzy. Good. That's good. He stood, bones creaking, and moved to look out the window. The storm had passed. Snow lay thick on the ground, transforming the landscape into an alien world of white and shadow, but the sky was clear and pale, promising a cold but fair day. I should check on the animals, he said. Make sure they weathered the storm all right. Of course. Abigail settled into the rocking chair he'd vacated, adjusting Emma to nurse more comfortably. We'll be fine here. We'll be fine. Not I'll be fine. We. As if she and Emma were already a unit, already linked in ways that transcended the bare 48 hours they'd known each other. Jacob pulled on his heavy coat, his boots, his hat, and gloves. The cold hit him like a wall when he opened the door, stealing his breath, but it was good too, clean and sharp, and clearing the cobwebs from his mind. He waded through knee-deep snow to the barn, where his 2 horses and the milk goat had taken shelter. They were fine, if hungry and indignant about being left unattended for so long. Jacob fed them, checked their water, mucked out their stalls. All the familiar rhythms of ranch life that had kept him sane in the weeks after Sarah died. Physical work that didn't require thinking, that let his hands move while his mind went quiet. By the time he returned to the cabin an hour later, full daylight had arrived. Smoke curled from the chimney, and through the window he could see Abigail moving around inside, Emma presumably asleep somewhere. The sight filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the promise of fire and hot coffee. He stomped the snow off his boots before entering, bringing a blast of cold air with him. Abigail looked up from the stove where she was frying eggs she must have found in the basket where Jacob had been keeping them, probably collected days ago and forgotten in his despair. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the pan. You need to eat properly, and so do I if I'm going to keep feeding Emma. I don't mind, Jacob said. The smell of cooking food made his stomach growl. When had he last eaten a real meal? He couldn't remember. They ate together at the table, Emma sleeping peacefully in the cradle nearby. It was strange how quickly this had started to feel normal, sharing a meal with this woman, listening to her talk about inconsequential things, watching her smile when Emma made small noises in her sleep, like they were a family instead of 2 strangers thrown together by desperation and storm. I'll ride to Sage Hollow today, Jacob said as he pushed his empty plate away. Get that message to your sister. Pick up some supplies. We're low on pretty much everything. It's a long ride, Tin, Abigail said, especially with the snow. 15 miles. I've done it in worse weather. He hesitated. Will you be all right here alone? With Emma? The question seemed to amuse her. I've been caring for babies since I was old enough to hold one. My mother had 7 children. I was the oldest. And then Thomas. Her voice caught slightly, but she pushed through. Yes, Jacob. We'll be fine. Right. Of course. He felt foolish for asking, but the thought of leaving them, of leaving Emma specifically, made his chest tight with anxiety. What if something happened while he was gone? What if Emma suddenly rejected Abigail's milk the way she'd rejected everything else? What if... Jacob. Abigail's hand covered his where it rested on the table. Go. Do what you need to do. Emma will be here when you get back, happy and fed and safe. I promise. Her hand was warm, calloused from work, smaller than Sarah's but just as capable. Jacob looked down at it, covering his own, and felt something shift inside him. Nothing romantic, not yet, but an awareness of her as more than just a means to keep his daughter alive. As a person. A woman. Someone who'd suffered her own losses and was still here, still fighting, still able to promise safety to a child who wasn't hers. Thank you, he said quietly. Abigail squeezed his hand once, then withdrew. You should get going if you want to be back before dark. The days are short this time of year. She was right. Jacob gathered his things, his rifle, his saddlebags, a list of supplies he needed to purchase. He saddled his horse, a sturdy gelding named Ranger, who'd carried him through worse than this. And then, because he couldn't help himself, he went back inside one more time to check on Emma. She was still asleep, her tiny fist curled beside her head, her rosebud mouth making small sucking motions even in dreams. Abigail stood beside the cradle, watching her with that same tender expression Jacob was starting to recognize. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "We'll be here." Jacob nodded, then impulsively bent and pressed a kiss to Emma's forehead. Her skin was warm, healthy. She smelled like milk and baby, like life continuing despite everything that had tried to stop it. When he straightened, he found Abigail watching him with eyes that held understanding and something else, something that might have been longing or grief or hope. He couldn't tell which. "Be safe," she said. "Always am," Jacob replied, and stepped out into the bright, cold morning. The ride to Sage Hollow took longer than usual, the snow making the trail treacherous, but Ranger was sure-footed and patient. Jacob used the time to think, to process everything that had happened in the last 2 days. His daughter had been dying. A stranger had appeared. That stranger was now living in his house, wearing his dead wife's clothes, feeding his child from her own body. When he laid it out like that, it sounded insane, impossible, wrong even. But it didn't feel wrong. That was the strange part. It felt like the first right thing that had happened since Sarah died. The town of Sage Hollow was busy despite the snow, people going about their business with the determined pragmatism of frontier folk who couldn't afford to let weather slow them down. Jacob tied Ranger outside the general store and went in to place his supply order: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and a dozen other staples he'd let run low. "Good to see you, Jacob," said Mr. Henderson, the store owner. "Been worried about you out there all alone. How's that baby of yours?" "Better," Jacob said, keeping his voice neutral. "Much better. Glad to hear it. We were all real sorry about Sarah. Fine woman, your wife." "Thank you." He paid for the supplies, arranged to have them held until he could bring the wagon to collect them, and then made his way to the boarding house where Abigail's sister lived. It was a 3-story building on the main street, well-maintained, with a sign hanging outside that read, "Holloway House, clean rooms, fair rates." A woman answered his knock, tall, dark-haired like Abigail, but softer around the edges, with a face that suggested she smiled more easily than her sister. She looked at Jacob with polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Catherine. Is that you?" "It is. And you are?" "Jacob Hollis. I have a message from your sister, Abigail." Catherine's face transformed, worry flooding her features. "Abigail? Is she all right? She was supposed to arrive 2 days ago before the storm. I've been frantic." "She's fine," Jacob assured her quickly. "She got caught in the blizzard, lost her horse. She took shelter at my ranch. I told her I'd ride here to let you know she's safe." Relief washed over Catherine's face, followed quickly by confusion. "Your ranch? Iron Ridge?" "That's right. But that's... Forgive me, but aren't you the rancher whose wife just passed? With the baby?" Word traveled fast in small towns. Jacob nodded. "Emma, my daughter. She's 10 weeks old." Catherine's confusion deepened. "And Abigail is staying with you? Alone? Mr. Hollis, I don't mean to be indelicate, but surely you understand how people might—" "I understand perfectly," Jacob interrupted, "which is why I'd appreciate it if we could keep the details quiet. Your sister is recovering from her ordeal. She's helping me with Emma until she's strong enough to make the journey here. That's all." It wasn't all, and they both knew it, but Catherine seemed to recognize that pushing would get her nowhere. She studied Jacob for a long moment, her expression shrewd, then nodded slowly. "How long will she be staying with you?" "I don't know. A week, perhaps. Maybe 2. Depends on the weather and her recovery." "I see." Catherine folded her arms across her chest. "Mr. Hollis, my sister has been through a great deal. If anyone takes advantage of her situation—" "No one is taking advantage of anyone," Jacob said firmly. "Your sister saved my daughter's life. I'm trying to repay that debt by giving her a safe place to stay until she's ready to continue her journey. That's all." It was mostly true. True enough, anyway. Catherine seemed to accept this, though suspicion still lingered in her eyes. "All right. Please tell Abigail I'm glad she's safe, and to send word when she's ready to come here. I'll keep a room available for her." "I'll tell her, thank you." Jacob tipped his hat and turned to leave, but Catherine's voice stopped him. "Mr. Hollis?" He looked back. "Take care of her, please. She's more fragile than she lets on." Jacob thought of the woman he'd left at his ranch, the way she held Emma, the strength in her voice when she promised they'd be fine, the grief she carried like a weight but refused to let crush her. "She's stronger than you think," he said. "But yes, I'll take care of her." The ride back to Iron Ridge seemed shorter somehow, or maybe Jacob was just eager to return. The sun was hanging low in the western sky by the time his cabin came into view, smoke still curling from the chimney, the windows glowing with lamplight against the gathering dusk. He was home. The warmth that greeted Jacob when he pushed open the cabin door felt like an embrace. Abigail looked up from where she sat mending one of his shirts by lamplight, Emma asleep against her shoulder, and smiled. "You're back," she said, and there was genuine relief in her voice. "I was starting to worry." "Took longer than I expected," Jacob admitted, stamping snow off his boots. "Trail was rough in places. How was she?" "Perfect. Nursed 4 times, slept between feedings, and only fussed when her diaper needed changing." Abigail's smile widened. "She's a good baby, Jacob. Easy." Jacob crossed to them, running a gentle finger down Emma's cheek. His daughter's skin was warmer than it had been yesterday, healthier. The difference 2 days of proper feeding had made was almost miraculous. "Your sister sends her love," he said, straightening. "Catherine. I told her you were recovering from the storm, that you'd come to Sage Hollow when you were ready." "What did she say?" Jacob hesitated. "She was concerned. About propriety. About you staying here alone with me." Abigail's expression tightened. Of course she was. Catherine has always been the respectable one, the one who does everything right. There was bitterness in her voice, old and deep. "She cares about you," Jacob offered. "I know, in her way." Abigail adjusted Emma against her shoulder, her movements automatic, maternal. "What did you tell her about why I'm really staying?" "Nothing, just that you were helping with Emma. She didn't press for details." "She will eventually. Everyone will." Abigail looked down at the baby in her arms. "People aren't stupid, Jacob. A widow with milk staying at a widower's ranch? They'll figure it out, and when they do, they'll talk. They'll say terrible things about both of us." Jacob knew she was right. Already he could imagine the whispers that would follow them through Sage Hollow, the judgment in people's eyes, the assumptions about what was happening at Iron Ridge. A man and woman living together, unmarried, improper. Never mind that it was innocent. Never mind that Abigail was saving his daughter's life. People would create their own narrative, and it wouldn't be kind. "Let them talk," he said finally. "I don't care what they think." "You say that now. But when it affects your reputation, your ability to do business in town, I said I don't care." Jacob's voice came out harder than he intended. "Emma is alive because of you. That's all that matters." Abigail studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "All right, we'll deal with it when it comes." The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Jacob woke early to tend the animals and do the endless work that winter ranch life demanded. Breaking ice in water troughs, hauling feed, checking fences for damage from the snow. When he returned to the cabin, Abigail would have breakfast ready and Emma freshly fed and content. They fell into an easy domesticity that Jacob tried not to examine too closely. Abigail cooked while he chopped wood. He mended harnesses while she washed diapers. They talked during meals about nothing important at first, just the small observations that make up daily life. The weather, the animals, how much Emma was eating, how well she was sleeping. But gradually, as the week wore on, the conversations deepened. Abigail told him about growing up in Virginia, about her family's move west when she was 15, about meeting her husband at a dance and knowing immediately he was the one. Jacob shared stories about building the ranch, about his own childhood in Missouri, about the dreams he and Sarah had harbored for their future. They didn't talk much about their dead spouses directly. The grief was still too raw, too immediate. But they wove around it, acknowledging its presence without letting it dominate every conversation. It was a delicate dance, this sharing of space and sorrow, but somehow they managed it. Emma thrived. By the end of the first week, she'd gained visible weight. her cheeks filling out, her arms and legs growing plumper. She stayed awake for longer periods, her eyes, Sarah's eyes, Jacob's eyes, following movement around the cabin with increasing interest. And she smiled. Not the gas-induced grimaces newborns made, but real smiles that lit up her whole face and made Jacob's chest ache with love so fierce it frightened him. Abigail witnessed that first real smile, and the expression that crossed her face was so complex, joy and grief and longing all tangled together, that Jacob had to look away. "She knows you," he said quietly. "She trusts you." "Babies trust whoever feeds them," Abigail replied, but her voice was thick with emotion. "It's more than that." It was true. Emma had begun to recognize Abigail, to settle immediately when placed in her arms, to make small, contented noises when Abigail sang to her. The bond forming between them was undeniable, and it should have made Jacob grateful. It did make him grateful. But it also sparked a strange possessiveness he didn't know what to do with. Emma was his daughter. But increasingly, she was also Abigail's in ways that had nothing to do with blood, and everything to do with care, with presence, with the 1,000 small intimacies that made up motherhood. By the second week, the weather had cleared enough that travel was possible again. Jacob knew he should say something, should ask Abigail when she planned to continue her journey to Catherine's boarding house. But every time he opened his mouth to bring it up, the words died in his throat. He didn't want her to go. The realization came to him one evening as he sat by the fire watching Abigail rock Emma to sleep, humming a lullaby under her breath. She'd taken to wearing Sarah's dresses without asking anymore, had reorganized the kitchen to her liking, had made small changes to the cabin that should have felt like intrusions but instead felt like improvements, like she belonged there, like they were a family. The thought should have felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory, should have filled him with guilt, but instead what Jacob felt was hope, fragile and frightened, but real. Abigail must have felt his gaze because she looked up and their eyes met across the small cabin. Something passed between them in that moment, some silent acknowledgement of what was happening, what had already happened. Then she looked away, focusing on Emma, and the moment broke. But it had been there. They'd both felt it. That night, after Abigail had retired to the bedroom with Emma, Jacob sat alone by the dying fire and forced himself to think clearly. He was attracted to Abigail. He could admit that now. Not just grateful, not just appreciative of what she was doing for Emma. He liked her, enjoyed her company, found himself looking forward to the moments when she laughed, when she teased him about his cooking, when she told stories about her childhood that made him see her as more than just a grieving widow. But it had only been 2 weeks. 2 weeks since she'd stumbled into his life. Sarah had been dead barely 6 weeks. It was too soon, way too soon. People would be scandalized, and rightly so. And yet Emma needed Abigail. Not just her milk, though that was still essential. She needed the tenderness, the attention, the mother's love that Abigail gave so freely. Could Jacob really take that away from his daughter just because the timing felt wrong? Could he take it away from Abigail, who had found purpose again in caring for Emma, who smiled more each day, whose eyes had lost some of their haunted quality? Could he take it away from himself? He didn't have answers, only questions that kept him awake long into the night. The next morning, everything changed. Jacob had ridden to check the north pasture fence, an hour's ride from the cabin. When he returned just before noon, he found Abigail in a state of barely controlled panic, pacing the cabin with Emma wailing in her arms. "What's wrong?" he demanded, fear spiking through him. "Is she sick?" No, she's fine. She's just..." Abigail's voice was shaking. "There were riders, 3 of them. They stopped at the gate, saw your sign about the baby needing milk. They wanted to know if everything was all right now?" Jacob felt his stomach drop. "What did you tell them?" "I said I was visiting, that I was helping with the baby. But Jacob, they looked at me. The way they looked at me..." Her voice cracked. "They know. They figured it out. I could see it in their faces." "Did you recognize them?" "One of them, Mr. Wilson from the feed store in Sage Hollow. He asked how long I'd been visiting, asked if Emma was eating well now. The way he said it..." She broke off, tears starting to stream down her face. "They're going to tell everyone. The whole town will know by tomorrow." Jacob took Emma from her arms, trying to calm the baby who'd picked up on Abigail's distress. "It's all right. Let them talk. We haven't done anything wrong. Haven't we? Abigail turned on him, her eyes wild with something close to hysteria. I'm living in your house, Jacob, alone with you, nursing your child. In what world is that proper? In a world where my daughter would have died without you. That doesn't matter to them. They'll call me. They'll say I'm... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jacob knew what she meant. The words people would use, loose woman, Jezebel, homewrecker, even though there was no home to wreck. And they'd say worse about him, taking advantage of a grieving widow, replacing his wife before she was cold in the ground, shaming Sarah's memory. Abigail, I should leave, she said abruptly. Right now. I'll go to Catherine's, explain everything, distance myself before this gets worse. No. The word came out sharper than Jacob intended. Emma started crying harder, and he had to bounce her gently to settle her. No, you're not leaving. Jacob, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Emma still needs you. You still need... He stopped himself, but too late. Still need what? Abigail asked, her voice suddenly quiet. Still need her? Still need to pretend she's mine? The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Abigail sank into the rocking chair, burying her face in her hands. And you're right. I do need her. God help me, Jacob, but I need her so much it scares me. When I hold her, when I feed her, for just a little while I can pretend Thomas didn't die. That I'm still a mother. That my life didn't end 4 months ago. Jacob's throat tightened. Emma had quieted in his arms, and he carried her to Abigail, crouching beside the chair. You are still a mother. Being Thomas's mother doesn't end just because he's gone. Doesn't it? Abigail looked up at him, her face ravaged by tears. Some days I can barely remember his face. What kind of mother forgets her own child's face? You haven't forgotten. You're healing. There's a difference. Is there? She reached out and touched Emma's hand, and the baby's fingers immediately curled around hers. The simple gesture seemed to break something in Abigail. I can't stay here, Jacob, not with the whole town talking. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to Emma. When she's older, people will remember. They'll whisper about how her father took up with a woman barely a month after her mother died. She'll carry that shame her whole life. Or she'll know that when she needed help, 2 broken people found each other and figured out how to keep going, Jacob countered. That's not shameful. That's survival. Abigail shook her head. You don't understand what it's like. Being a woman with a ruined reputation. I've seen it happen to others. They become ghosts in their own towns. No one speaks to them. Shopkeepers won't serve them. Children are taught to avoid them. Then we'll go somewhere else, Jacob said. The words surprised him even as he spoke them, but once they were out, he knew they were right. We'll leave Iron Ridge, start over somewhere nobody knows us. Somewhere the gossip can't follow. Abigail stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You'd give up your ranch? The home you built with Sarah? Everything you've worked for? I'd do anything to keep Emma safe and healthy, Jacob said simply. And right now, that means keeping you here with us. The silence that followed was broken only by Emma's soft breathing and the crackle of the fire. Abigail searched Jacob's face, and he let her look, let her see whatever truth she needed to find there. You don't know what you're saying, she finally whispered. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearer than I have in weeks. Jacob stood, still holding Emma, and paced to the window. Snow was falling again, light flurries that danced in the wind. I know this is fast, I know it seems crazy, but Abigail, when you walked through that door 2 weeks ago, you saved more than Emma's life. You saved mine too. You gave me a reason to keep going, to believe that maybe we don't have to grieve alone. Jacob, I'm not asking you to marry me, he continued quickly. I'm not asking for anything except that you stay, that you let us be whatever this is. Family, maybe? Or just 3 people helping each other survive the winter. I don't know, but please don't go. Abigail rose from the chair and crossed to him, stopping just close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd started using. Sarah's soap. What if staying hurts us both more than leaving would? What if it doesn't? They stood like that, caught in the space between hope and fear, between propriety and need. Emma stirred in Jacob's arms, making small, hungry noises, and Abigail's body responded immediately. He could see the wetness beginning to spread through her dress, her body preparing to feed a child it had claimed as its own. She needs you. Jacob said softly. That's not fair. I know, but it's true. Abigail closed her eyes, her whole body trembling. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face, but her voice was steady. 1 month. I'll stay 1 more month. Give Emma time to transition to bottles. Give you time to find a proper nurse if needed. But after that, I'm going to Catherine's. I have to, Jacob, for all our sakes. It wasn't what Jacob wanted to hear, but it was something. A reprieve. Time to change her mind, to show her that this could work, that they could build something together from their shared wreckage. 1 month, he agreed. Abigail took Emma from his arms and settled into the rocking chair to nurse. Jacob watched them, memorizing the scene, the way afternoon light caught in Abigail's dark hair, the peaceful expression on Emma's face as she fed, the gentle rocking motion that seemed to calm all three of them. 1 month. He'd make it enough. But the town had other plans. 2 days later, Jacob rode to Sage Hollow for more supplies and found the atmosphere toward him decidedly cooler. Mr. Henderson at the general store was curt, his usual friendly chatter replaced by clipped efficiency. Mrs. Patterson, who'd brought food after Sarah's funeral, crossed to the other side of the street when she saw him coming, and when he stopped at the saloon for a drink, the conversations around him died into whispers. He ignored it all, collected his supplies, and was preparing to leave when Sheriff Tom Bradley approached him outside the general store. Jacob, got a minute? Bradley was a good man, fair-minded and not given to judgment. Jacob had known him for 5 years, had helped him track down cattle rustlers the previous spring. But now the sheriff's expression was carefully neutral, and Jacob's gut tightened with apprehension. What can I do for you, Tom? Need to talk to you about the situation at your ranch. What situation? Bradley sighed. Don't make me spell it out. You know what people are saying. Let them say it. Jacob, I'm trying to help you here. There's talk about the woman staying with you, Abigail Rowe. Some folks are concerned about the propriety of the arrangement. Abigail is helping with my daughter, Jacob said flatly. Emma would have died without her. I don't care what people think about propriety. I understand that, I do. But you got to understand how it looks. A young widow, no chaperone, living in your house barely a month after Sarah passed. Bradley lowered his voice. There's some talking about bringing it before the church council, making it an official matter. Jacob felt rage kindle in his chest. The church council? For what? I haven't broken any laws. No, but there are standards of behavior expected in this community. Moral standards. Moral standards, Jacob repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. My daughter was starving to death, Tom. Abigail's baby had died and her body was still producing milk. She saved Emma's life. Where in your moral standards does it say, I should have let my child die to avoid gossip? Bradley held up his hands. I'm not saying you should have. I'm just warning you that this could get ugly. There are people, good people, people who cared about Sarah, who feel like you're disrespecting her memory. By keeping our daughter alive? By moving another woman into your house so fast? The accusation hung in the cold air between them. Jacob wanted to hit something, wanted to rage at the injustice of it, but he forced himself to stay calm. Abigail is leaving in a month, he said finally. She's going to her sister's boarding house. That satisfy the moral guardians of Sage Hollow? Bradley looked relieved. That's good, Jacob. That's real good. I'll pass that along. Maybe calm folks down. You do that. Jacob climbed onto Ranger, gathering the reins. And Tom, you tell those good people who care so much about Sarah's memory that she would have been the first to help a grieving mother. That she would have done exactly what Abigail is doing without a second thought, because that's who Sarah was. And anyone who knew her should remember that. He rode away before Bradley could respond, his hands shaking with anger. The entire way back to Iron Ridge, he thought about what the sheriff had said, about the church council, about moral standards, about people who'd known Sarah judging him for the very compassion she would have shown. When he reached the cabin, Abigail took one look at his face and knew. It was bad, she said. Not a question. Bad enough. Jacob dismounted and began unloading supplies, his movements jerky with suppressed fury. Sheriff came to talk to me, said there's talk of bringing it before the church council. Abigail went pale. The church council? Jacob, they can't actually do anything, can they? They can make our lives hell. Can pressure me to send you away, pressure Catherine to refuse to house you when you do leave. can make sure neither of us can show our faces in town without judgment. He carried a sack of flour inside, dropping it harder than necessary on the counter. All in the name of protecting Sarah's precious memory. Maybe they're right, Abigail said quietly. Maybe we are being disrespectful. Jacob spun to face her. Don't you dare let them make you feel ashamed of saving my daughter's life. It's not just about Emma anymore, though, is it? Abigail met his gaze steadily. You said it yourself 2 days ago. I saved your life too. This has become about more than just feeding a baby, Jacob, and we both know it. He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. She was right. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, this had transformed from a simple arrangement of necessity into something deeper, more complicated. He looked forward to coming home to her, found himself listening for her voice, her laughter, caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noticing the graceful way she moved, the quick intelligence in her eyes, the strength she carried despite her grief. He was falling in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Too soon, his mind screamed. Sarah's barely cold. This is wrong. This is betrayal. But his heart, his treacherous, healing heart, whispered something different. This is survival. This is hope. This is what Sarah would want for you, for Emma. Jacob? Abigail's voice pulled him back. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What are you thinking? He opened his mouth to lie, to say it was nothing, to deflect. But looking at her standing there in his kitchen wearing Sarah's dress, holding their daughter who was healthy and thriving, he couldn't do it. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that maybe those people are right to be concerned. Because this stopped being just about Emma a while ago, and we both know it. Abigail's breath caught. Jacob, I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I know it's too soon. I know it's wrong. Sarah's barely been gone 6 weeks, and here I am feeling things I have no right to feel. But I can't lie about it anymore. The silence that followed felt eternal. Abigail stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and something else, fear maybe, or hope, or both tangled together so completely they couldn't be separated. You can't, she finally whispered. I know. Sarah would understand, Jacob said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Sarah would understand that grief doesn't follow schedules, that healing doesn't wait for permission. She was practical that way, clear-eyed. But the town, damn the town, Jacob said. Then softer, damn them all, Abigail. They don't get a vote in this. Abigail's eyes filled with tears. What are you asking me? I don't know. I don't know what I'm asking. I just know that the thought of you leaving in a month feels like losing Sarah all over again, like watching another piece of my life die because the world says it's too soon to hold on to it. And what about me? Abigail's voice shook. What about what I feel? What do you feel? She closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I feel like I'm betraying Thomas. Every time I hold Emma, every time I feel happy or content or like maybe life might be worth living after all, I feel like I'm forgetting him, replacing him. You're not, and I feel like I'm falling in love with you too, she continued, the words rushing out now like a confession. And that terrifies me more than anything, because it's too soon and too fast and too wrong, and I don't know if what I feel is real or if I'm just so desperate for something to hold on to that I'd convince myself of anything. Jacob crossed the room in 3 strides and took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. Whatever this is between us, it's real. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's something more. I don't know, but it's real. And it's helping us both survive, and that has to count for something. But what do we do with it? Abigail asked, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. How do we navigate this without destroying ourselves or Emma? I don't know, Jacob admitted. I don't have answers, but I know running away from it won't work. You can't leave now, Abigail. Not in a month. Not ever. Jacob, stay. Please. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Abigail searched his face, her expression torn. The scandal will destroy you. Your reputation, your business. I don't care. You say that now.
I'll say it forever, Jacob interrupted. Abigail, I already lost the love of my life once. I won't lose another chance at happiness because people I don't even respect think it's improper. From the cradle came a soft cry. Emma, waking from her nap. The sound broke the tension between them, and Abigail pulled away from Jacob's hands to go to the baby. We can't make decisions like this, she said as she lifted Emma. Not in the heat of the moment. We need to think, to be sure. How much more sure do you need to be? Jacob, please. Abigail's voice was pleading now. Don't push me. I can't. I need time to think. He wanted to argue, wanted to press the point, but the fear in her eyes stopped him. He'd already said too much, pushed too hard.
If he wasn't careful, he'd drive her away entirely. All right, he said quietly. Time. But Abigail? I meant what I said. All of it. She nodded once, then turned her attention to Emma, who was fussing to be fed. Jacob watched them for a moment, the woman he was falling in love with nursing the daughter he'd almost lost, and felt his resolve harden. Whatever it took, whatever he had to sacrifice, he was going to keep them both. The town could whisper all it wanted. The church council could judge. It didn't matter. This was his family now, and he'd protect it with everything he had. That night, after Emma had been fed and settled and Abigail had retreated to the bedroom, Jacob sat by the fire and thought about Sarah. About the life they'd planned together, the future that had been stolen from them. About whether loving Abigail meant betraying Sarah's memory. And then clear as day, he heard Sarah's voice in his head. Not a ghost, not supernatural, just memory speaking with the clarity of truth. Stop being stubborn, Jacob Hollis. That baby needs a mother, and you need someone to keep you from turning into a bitter old hermit. If Abigail makes you happy, if she's good to Emma, then hold on to her and don't let go. Life's too short and too hard to turn away from love when it finds you. It was exactly what Sarah would have said, practical, clear-eyed, focused on what mattered instead of what people thought. Jacob smiled despite himself, despite everything. All right, Sarah, he whispered to the empty room. I hear you. And for the first time since he'd buried his wife on that windswept hillside, Jacob felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found a way to give him permission to move forward. Now he just had to convince Abigail to take that step with him. The following days passed in a state of careful tension, like both Jacob and Abigail were walking on ice that might crack at any moment. They spoke to each other with exaggerated politeness, avoided being alone together when possible, and pretended that Jacob's confession hadn't fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the cabin. But the unspoken words hung between them like a physical presence, impossible to ignore no matter how hard they tried. Emma, oblivious to the adult complications swirling around her, continued to thrive. She was nearly 3 months old now, her personality emerging in small but distinct ways. She smiled readily, especially at Abigail, whose face she studied with intense concentration during feedings. She'd started making cooing sounds that delighted them both despite the awkwardness, and her little fists were strong enough now to grab onto fingers and hold tight. Jacob caught himself watching Abigail with Emma more often than was probably wise. The tenderness in her expression when she nursed his daughter, the gentle way she spoke to the baby, the songs she sang in a voice that trembled with emotion, it all spoke of a love that transcended biology. Abigail had become Emma's mother in every way that mattered, and they both knew it made the situation infinitely more complicated. On the 4th day after Jacob's confession, Catherine arrived. Jacob was in the barn when he heard the wagon approaching. He emerged to find a well-dressed woman climbing down from the driver's seat, her expression a mixture of determination and barely concealed disapproval. Behind her, a younger man, presumably her hired driver, waited with the reins. "Mr. Hollis," Catherine said, her voice cool but polite. "I've come for my sister." Jacob's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "Miss Holloway, this is unexpected." "Is it?" Catherine's eyes were sharp, assessing. "Abigail has been here nearly 3 weeks. I think I've been more than patient given the circumstances." "She's been helping with my daughter, so I've heard. The whole town has heard, Mr. Hollis, in great detail." Catherine pulled her cloak tighter against the cold wind. "Is she inside?" Jacob wanted to refuse, to send this woman away and protect the fragile peace of his household, but he had no right to keep Abigail from her sister. She is. Come in. Abigail looked up from where she sat mending near the fire when the door opened, Emma asleep in the cradle beside her. Her face went pale when she saw Catherine. Kathy, what are you doing here? I came to take you home, Catherine said, her voice gentler now that she was addressing her sister. You've been here long enough, Abby. It's time to come to Sage Hollow, where you belong. Abigail's hand stilled on the mending. I can't leave, not yet. Emma has a father to care for her, Catherine interrupted. A father who needs to learn to manage on his own, as difficult as that may be. Jacob bristled. Abigail has been essential to my daughter's survival. Emma was dying before she arrived. And now she's clearly thriving, Catherine said, glancing at the sleeping baby, which means the crisis has passed, and it's time for Abigail to resume her own life. Surely you can see that, Mr. Hollis. What I see is a woman who's helping my family. There's nothing improper about that. Catherine's laugh was sharp and humorless. Nothing improper. Mr. Hollis, my sister is living alone with you in this isolated cabin. The talk in town is absolutely vicious. They're calling her terrible names, saying unspeakable things about both of you. Every day she stays here, her reputation deteriorates further. Abigail had gone even paler. What are they saying exactly? Catherine hesitated, then seemed to decide honesty was necessary. That you're his mistress. That you moved in with indecent haste to take advantage of a grieving widower? That you're trying to replace his wife and steal his daughter? She paused. Some are even suggesting that you and Mr. Hollis were involved before his wife died. That's a lie, Jacob said harshly. I never met Abigail until the night of the storm. Anyone who suggests otherwise is a liar and a gossip. Of course it's a lie, Catherine agreed, but that doesn't stop people from believing it. You know how these things work, Mr. Hollis. Once a woman's reputation is damaged, the truth doesn't matter anymore. Abigail stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her mending basket. I need some air. She grabbed her cloak and fled outside before either Jacob or Catherine could stop her. They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, then Catherine sighed. She cares about your daughter, she said quietly. I can see that. But Mr. Hollis, you must understand, this arrangement is destroying her. Every day that passes makes it harder for her to reclaim any kind of normal life. What's normal about any of our lives right now? Jacob asked. Her son is dead. My wife is dead. We're both trying to survive our grief, and we've found a way to help each other do that. Why is that so terrible? Because it's not sustainable, Catherine said. What happens when Abigail does leave? When Emma has to lose another mother figure? What happens when you eventually remarry? Because you will, Mr. Hollis, a man with a young child needs a wife, and your new wife has to live with the scandal of what happened here? Jacob hadn't thought that far ahead, had deliberately avoided thinking about a future that didn't include Abigail. But Catherine's words forced him to confront the reality of their situation. What was his plan exactly? To keep Abigail here indefinitely, feeding his daughter, living in limbo between grief and something unnamed? To eventually ask her to marry him, despite it being mere weeks since both their spouses died? The complication seemed insurmountable when laid out like that. But the alternative? Losing Abigail, watching Emma lose the only mother she'd known, going back to being alone, felt impossible too. I don't have all the answers, he admitted finally, but I know that sending Abigail away right now would hurt all three of us, Emma included. Catherine studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. You care about her, about Abigail. It wasn't a question, but Jacob answered anyway. Yes. Does she know? Yes. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, she looked almost sad. Mr. Hollis, I understand that you're lonely, that you've suffered a terrible loss, and you're grasping at anything that might ease that pain. But using my sister as a replacement for your dead wife isn't fair to anyone, least of all her. The accusation stung because part of Jacob feared it might be true. Was he in love with Abigail, or was he just desperately trying to fill the Sarah-shaped hole in his life with the nearest available woman? But no, what he felt for Abigail was distinct, different from what he'd felt for Sarah. It wasn't replacement. It was something new, born from shared grief and unexpected connection. I'm not replacing Sarah, he said firmly. What I feel for Abigail is separate.
real. And I think she feels it too. Which makes this even more complicated, Catherine said. Because if you do care about each other, then you're trapped. Too soon to act on those feelings without causing scandal. Too late to pretend they don't exist. So what's your solution, Mr.
Hollis? Keep her here in limbo, destroying both your reputations, unable to move forward or back? Before Jacob could answer, the door opened and Abigail stepped back inside. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was composed, determined. Catherine's right, she said without preamble. I need to leave. Jacob felt his chest constrict. Abigail, no, listen to me, both of you. She moved to stand by the fire, her back to them both. I've been hiding here, using Emma as an excuse to avoid facing my grief, my life, my future. That's not fair to her, and it's not fair to you, Jacob. You haven't been hiding? Yes, I have. Abigail turned to face him, her expression anguished. Every time I hold her, every time I feed her, I pretend she's Thomas. I pretend my baby didn't die, that my husband is just out working and will be home for supper. I've built an entire fantasy in my head, and it's not healthy for any of us. That's not true, Jacob said, but even as he spoke, he wondered if she might be right. Had he noticed the faraway look in her eyes sometimes when she held Emma? The way she sometimes called the baby by a different name before catching herself? He dismissed it as simple grief, but maybe it was more than that. I love her, Abigail continued, her voice breaking. I love Emma like she's my own, and that's exactly the problem. She's not mine. She's yours and Sarah's, and I have no right to insert myself into that bond. When she's old enough to understand, what will you tell her about me? About why I was here? I'll tell her you saved her life, Jacob said. I'll tell her you loved her when she needed love most. And what about us? Abigail asked softly. What will you tell her about why you fell in love with someone barely 6 weeks after her mother died? How do you explain that without making it seem like you didn't love Sarah enough? The question hit Jacob like a physical blow. It was the fear he'd been avoiding, the guilt that gnawed at him in the dark hours before dawn. Did loving Abigail diminish what he'd felt for Sarah? Did it make him shallow, inconstant, unworthy of either woman's affection? I love Sarah with everything I had, he said, his voice rough. Her death nearly destroyed me. But Abigail, you showed me that I could survive it, that there was still life worth living, still love worth feeling. That doesn't negate what I felt for Sarah, it builds on it. She taught me how to love, and now I'm using those lessons to love again. Abigail's eyes filled with tears. That's beautiful, Jacob, and maybe it's even true. But it doesn't change the fact that acting on these feelings now would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Catherine had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up. Come home with me, Abby. Give yourself time away from here. Time to grieve properly, to heal, to figure out what you really want. If what you and Mr. Hollis feel is real, it will survive separation, and if it's not, if it's just grief and loneliness and desperation, then distance will reveal that too. It was sensible advice, the kind of practical wisdom Jacob wanted to reject but couldn't quite argue against. Because Catherine was right about one thing. They were trapped in a situation with no good options. Stay together and destroy both their reputations. Separate and risk losing each other. Move forward too quickly and dishonor their dead spouses. Wait too long and let fear win. Abigail looked at Jacob, her expression pleading for him to understand, to let her go even though they both knew it would hurt. And Jacob, looking at her tear-stained face, at the woman who'd given his daughter life and given him hope, knew he couldn't be the one to trap her, even if letting her go felt like dying all over again. If you need to leave, then leave, he said quietly. I won't stop you. Abigail's face crumpled. Jacob, but know this. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his despite Catherine's presence. What we have isn't fantasy. It's not grief-induced delusion. It's real, and it's worth fighting for. So you go to Sage Hollow, you take your time, you figure out what you want. But Abigail, he squeezed her hands, I'll be here, waiting, for as long as it takes. Abigail let out a sob and pulled her hands away, pressing them to her mouth. I can't. I need to feed Emma one more time before I go. Please, just once more. Jacob nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched as Abigail moved to the cradle and lifted Emma with shaking hands. The baby stirred, made a small questioning sound, then settled against Abigail's chest as she moved to the rocking chair. Catherine discreetly turned her back, giving them what privacy she could in the small cabin. Jacob stood frozen, watching Abigail nurse his daughter for what might be the last time, and felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Abigail was crying silently as Emma fed, tears dripping onto the baby's blanket. She kept touching Emma's face, her hair, her tiny hands, like she was memorizing every detail. When Emma finished nursing and fell back asleep, sated and content, Abigail held her for a long moment before pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Be good for your papa," she whispered. "Grow up strong and brave and kind. And if you ever wonder whether you were loved—" Her voice broke completely. "You were. So much. More than you'll ever know." She stood carefully and carried Emma to Jacob. He took his daughter, their hands touching briefly in the transfer, and for a moment they just stood there, close enough to touch, to embrace, to change their minds about everything. But the moment passed. Abigail stepped back, wiping her eyes, and turned to Catherine. "I'm ready." "What about your things?" Catherine asked gently. "I don't have anything except the clothes I arrived in, and those are still wet somewhere, probably." Abigail looked down at Sarah's blue dress. "I should change." "Keep it," Jacob said roughly. "Keep the dress. Keep all of them. Sarah would want you to have them." Abigail's face twisted with fresh grief, but she nodded. She moved mechanically toward the door, Catherine following. On the threshold, she paused and looked back one more time. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible, "for everything, for letting me help, for giving me a reason to keep going. I'll never forget—" She couldn't finish. "Abigail," Jacob's voice stopped her. "This isn't goodbye. You hear me? This isn't goodbye." She smiled through her tears, sad and hopeful and heartbroken all at once. "I hope you're right." Then she was gone, stepping out into the cold afternoon with Catherine. Jacob stood in the doorway, Emma in his arms, watching as they climbed into the wagon. He watched as the driver urged the horses forward. He watched until the wagon disappeared down the snow-covered track, taking Abigail away from him. Only then did he close the door and sink into the rocking chair, holding his daughter close, and let himself break. Emma woke an hour later, hungry and fussy. Jacob tried the bottle, goat's milk warmed by the fire, and to his surprise and relief, Emma took it. Not eagerly, not with the same contentment she'd shown when nursing from Abigail, but she drank, she fed, she survived. It should have been a triumph. His daughter was eating from a bottle again, which meant she'd be fine, would grow and thrive even without Abigail. But all Jacob could feel was a hollow emptiness where hope used to live. The cabin felt impossibly large without Abigail in it. Every corner seemed to echo with her absence. The rocking chair where she'd spent hours nursing Emma. The kitchen where she'd cooked meals and reorganized supplies. The bedroom where she'd slept with Emma curled against her. All of it empty now, haunted by the ghost of what might have been. Jacob tried to settle into a routine. Feed Emma, change Emma, rock Emma to sleep, do the ranch work that had been neglected while his attention was elsewhere. Feed Emma again. The cycle repeated endlessly, mechanically, each day bleeding into the next with numbing sameness. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. Jacob rode to town for supplies and found the atmosphere toward him had shifted slightly. The hostile judgment had softened into something more like pity. Apparently, Abigail's departure had convinced people that the situation had been innocent after all, or at least that it was over now. Mrs. Patterson even stopped him to say she was glad he'd done the right thing. Jacob accepted her words with a terse nod and didn't bother explaining that sending Abigail away hadn't felt right at all. It had felt like tearing out a piece of himself that had only just started to heal. He avoided Holloway House, couldn't bring himself to pass by and risk seeing Abigail in the window or on the street. The temptation to stop, to demand she come back, to damn the consequences and claim what he wanted, it would be too strong. So he conducted his business quickly and rode back to Iron Ridge, back to his empty cabin and his daughter who was thriving physically, but who Jacob knew somehow was missing the woman who'd held her for 3 precious weeks. On the 10th day, Emma refused the bottle entirely. Jacob tried everything. Different temperatures, different nipples, different positions. Nothing worked. Emma would take a few sips, then turn her head away and cry. Not the hungry, desperate crying she'd done before Abigail arrived, but a different sound, confused, almost betrayed. Like she couldn't understand why the comfort she'd known had been taken away. By evening, Jacob was frantic. Emma had barely eaten all day, and the familiar terror from weeks ago was creeping back. What if she stopped eating entirely? What if she made herself sick? He couldn't lose her, not after everything. He saddled Ranger in the dark, wrapped Emma in blankets, and rode through the night to Sage Hollow. Holloway House was dark except for a single lamp burning in a downstairs window. Jacob tied Ranger and carried Emma to the door, pounding on it with more force than was probably necessary. A few minutes later, a disgruntled-looking man in a nightshirt answered. Catherine's hired hand, probably. "We're closed. I need to see Abigail Rowe," Jacob said. "It's an emergency." The man looked at Emma, fussing in Jacob's arms, and his expression softened. "Wait here." He disappeared back into the house. Jacob waited, bouncing Emma gently, whispering reassurances he didn't feel. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then the door opened again and Abigail stood there, wrapped in a robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked terrible, eyes red and swollen, face drawn, like she hadn't slept in days. But when she saw Emma, her expression transformed into something like salvation. "Jacob, is she all right?" "She won't eat," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "She took bottles for a few days, but today she refused everything. I tried, Abigail. I tried everything I could think of, but she wants—" He stopped, the truth too hard to speak. "She wants me," Abigail finished softly. Her hands were already reaching for the baby before she seemed to realize what she was doing. She pulled them back. "Jacob, I can't—" I know it's not fair to ask, but please, just tonight, just help me get her eating again, and I'll figure out the rest. Please, Abigail." He could see the war playing out across her face. The desperate desire to help warring with the knowledge that doing so would undo all the distance she'd tried to create. Behind her, Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs. "Abby, what's going on?" Abigail looked up at her sister, then back at Jacob and Emma. The baby was crying harder now, reaching toward Abigail with little grasping hands like she knew salvation was close if only the adults would cooperate. "I'm sorry," Abigail whispered to Catherine. Then louder, "I have to. I can't let her starve." She took Emma from Jacob's arms, and the baby immediately quieted, nuzzling against her chest. Abigail's body responded instantly. Jacob could see the wetness spreading through her nightgown, her breasts preparing to feed a child they'd been aching for. "Come inside," Catherine said from the stairs, her voice resigned, "before someone sees you and starts the gossip all over again." Jacob followed Abigail into the house, into a small sitting room where she settled immediately into a chair and began unbuttoning her nightgown. Jacob turned away, giving her privacy, but he could hear the soft sounds of Emma latching, beginning to nurse, and relief flooded through him so intensely it made him dizzy. Catherine appeared with a blanket, which she draped over Abigail and Emma. Then she turned to Jacob, her expression stern. "You shouldn't have come here." "I had no choice." "There's always a choice, Mr. Hollis. You chose to bring your daughter here in the middle of the night, forcing my sister to expose herself to scandal all over again because it was easier than finding another solution." The accusation stung, but Jacob couldn't entirely deny it. What other solution was there? Let my daughter starve? Find another wet nurse in the middle of the night? Teach her to take a bottle properly. Be patient. Sometimes babies refuse to eat for a day or two. It doesn't mean they're dying. "You weren't there before," Jacob said harshly. "You didn't watch Emma waste away, getting weaker every day, crying from hunger she couldn't satisfy. I know the difference between normal fussiness and genuine crisis." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "I believe you do. But, Mr. Hollis, what's your plan here? Have Abigail feed Emma tonight, then what? You can't keep coming back every time the baby refuses a bottle. Eventually, Emma has to learn to manage without her." "I know that." Jacob ran his hands through his hair, exhausted. "I know. But tonight I just needed her to eat." From the chair, Abigail spoke up. "It's all right, Kathy, I don't mind. Really." "That's exactly the problem," Catherine said. "You don't mind sacrificing yourself for them.
But Abby, you need to think about your own future, about what happens when Mr. Hollis eventually finds a new wife. I don't want a new wife, Jacob interrupted. I want Abigail. The words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Catherine stared at him. Abigail's hand stilled on Emma's back, though the baby continued nursing, oblivious to the adult drama. Jacob, Abigail whispered, don't. Why not? It's true. Catherine wants honesty? Fine. I'm in love with your sister. I want her to come back to Iron Ridge, to be Emma's mother and my... He stopped, not quite able to say wife. Not yet. My partner. My family. Catherine's laugh was sharp and incredulous. You're mad. Both of you are mad.
Your spouses have been dead barely 2 months, and you're talking about marriage? I'm talking about survival, Jacob corrected. About 3 people who need each other finding a way to be together. Is that really so insane? Yes, Catherine threw up her hands. Yes, Mr. Hollis, it is insane. It's rushed and improper and doomed to fail. You're not thinking clearly. Neither of you are. Maybe not, Jacob admitted, but I know what I feel. And I know that these past 10 days without Abigail have been the longest, loneliest days of my life. Worse than the month after Sarah died, because then I didn't know what I was missing. Now I do. Abigail made a small sound, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. Emma had finished nursing and had fallen asleep, milk-drunk and content. Abigail adjusted her nightgown and shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting her back gently. This is impossible, she said finally. You know that, right? There's no way this ends well. Maybe, Jacob said. Or maybe we make our own ending. How? By defying the entire town? By letting them call us terrible names and shun us from decent society? If that's what it takes. And Emma? Abigail looked down at the sleeping baby. What about when she's old enough to understand the scandal? When other children taunt her about her father's whore who pretended to be her mother? The crude word made Jacob flinch, but he forced himself to address it head on. Then we move. Go somewhere new. California, maybe. Or Oregon. Somewhere nobody knows us. Where we can build a life without the weight of the past crushing us. Run away, Catherine said flatly. That's your solution? Abandon your ranch, your life, everything you've built, just to avoid judgment? To protect my family, Jacob corrected. Yes, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Abigail was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face. Jacob, you can't ask me to let you make that sacrifice. It's too much. I'm not asking. I'm telling you that's what I'll do. What I want to do. He moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. Abigail, I know it's fast, I know it seems crazy, but when you know something is right, does timing really matter? Yes, Catherine said firmly. Timing matters enormously. You need to grieve properly, both of you. You need to process your losses before you can even think about moving forward. And what if moving forward is how we grieve? Jacob asked. What if helping each other survive is the only way either of us can process what happened? Catherine opened her mouth to argue further, but Abigail cut her off. Kathy, please, could you give us a moment alone? Catherine looked like she wanted to refuse, to protect her sister from making what she clearly saw as a terrible mistake. But something in Abigail's expression must have convinced her, because she nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes. Then I'm coming back and Mr. Hollis is leaving. She swept out of the room, and Jacob and Abigail were alone except for sleeping Emma. You shouldn't have come here, Abigail said softly. You're making this so much harder. Good. It should be hard, because what we have, what we could have, is worth fighting for. But what do we actually have, Jacob? Abigail's voice was pleading. 3 weeks of living together under extraordinary circumstances. Grief and desperation and need all tangled up together. That's not a foundation for a life. Then we build one. Together. How? Tell me exactly how this works. Do we get married next week, next month? How long is long enough before people stop judging? A year, 2 years? And what do we do in the meantime? Keep meeting in secret? Keep feeding Emma until she's old enough to eat solid food and doesn't need me anymore? Jacob realized he didn't have answers to those questions. He'd been so focused on the feeling, on the certainty that what they had was real and worth preserving, that he hadn't thought through the practical details of how to actually make it work. "I don't know," he admitted. "But Abigail, I know that I'd rather face an uncertain future with you than a certain one without you. Doesn't that mean something?" Abigail looked down at Emma, stroking the baby's soft hair. "It means you're grieving and lonely and terrified of losing someone else you love. It doesn't necessarily mean we should get married." "But you do love Emma. You can't deny that." "Of course I love her." Abigail's voice broke. "I love her so much it physically hurts. But Jacob, that's exactly why I can't stay. Because eventually, Emma will be old enough to remember me, to understand that I'm not her real mother. And when that day comes, how do we explain why I'm here? What my role is? It's confusing and complicated, and she deserves better than that." She deserves to be loved," Jacob said fiercely, "by as many people as possible. Sarah's dead. She can't love Emma anymore, but you can. You do. Why is that wrong?" "It's not wrong. It's just—" Abigail struggled for words. "It's incomplete. I can love her, can be a mother to her in every way that matters, but only if we're willing to make it permanent, to give Emma the security of knowing I'll always be there. And Jacob, I don't know if I can promise that when everything is so uncertain." Jacob's heart leaped. "So make it certain. Marry me." Abigail stared at him, shocked. "Jacob, I know it's fast. I know people will talk. But Abigail, if we're going to do this, if we're going to be a family, then let's really do it. Let's make it permanent and real and legal, so Emma always knows you're hers and she's yours." "You're serious, completely." Abigail shook her head, looking overwhelmed. "This is insane. We barely know each other. I don't even know your middle name or what you like for breakfast or whether you snore." "James, eggs and bacon. And I do, apparently. Sarah used to complain about it." Jacob smiled despite the seriousness of the moment. "There. Now you know. What else do you need?" "Time," Abigail said desperately. "I need time to think, to breathe, to figure out if what I feel is real or just desperation masquerading as love." "How much time?" "I don't know. Months, probably. Long enough to be sure." "And in those months, what happens to Emma? To us?" Abigail closed her eyes, looking pained. "I don't know, Jacob. I don't have all the answers. I'm barely holding myself together as it is." Jacob reached out and covered her hand with his. "Then hold together with me. Let's figure it out as we go, together." Before Abigail could respond, Catherine reappeared in the doorway. "Time's up. Mr. Hollis, you need to leave before someone sees you here and starts the gossip all over again." Jacob stood reluctantly. Abigail rose too, still holding Emma, and they stood facing each other in the dim sitting room of Holloway House, the air thick with everything unsaid. "Think about it," Jacob said quietly. "That's all I ask. Think about whether you can imagine a future with us, and if you can—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Come home, Abigail. Please come home." He left before she could answer, before Catherine could usher him out, before he could see whether Abigail's expression held hope or heartbreak, or some mixture of both. The ride back to Iron Ridge seemed endless. Jacob's mind raced with everything that had been said, everything that remained uncertain. He'd proposed to a woman he'd known for less than a month. He'd offered to upend his entire life, to move across the country if necessary, all to be with someone the world would judge him for wanting. It was insane. Catherine was right about that, but it was also the most certain thing Jacob had felt since Sarah died. Now he just had to wait and see if Abigail felt the same way. The dawn broke cold and clear over Iron Ridge, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Jacob stood at the window with Emma in his arms, watching the sun rise and wondering if Abigail was watching the same sunrise from Catherine's boarding house 15 miles away. The baby had taken a bottle this morning, reluctantly, with much fussing, but she'd taken it. Small victories, Jacob told himself. They'd survive this, one small victory at a time. But survival wasn't the same as living, and Jacob was beginning to understand the difference. 3 days passed with no word from Abigail. Jacob threw himself into ranch work with almost desperate intensity, repairing fences that didn't need repair, reorganizing the barn, chopping enough firewood to last 2 winters.
Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on the woman who'd walked out of his life, taking most of his hope with her. Emma seemed to sense his distraction. She was fussier than usual, crying at odd hours, refusing to sleep unless Jacob walked her around the cabin singing the lullabies Abigail used to sing. He tried to remember all the words, stumbled over verses, made up new ones when memory failed. It didn't matter. Emma just needed to hear a voice, to feel motion, to know she wasn't alone. Jacob understood the feeling. On the fourth day, a letter arrived. The writer who delivered it was young, maybe 17, working for the postal service that ran between Sage Hollow and the outlying ranches. He handed Jacob the envelope with barely concealed curiosity. Everyone knew about the scandal by now, and a letter from town was bound to fuel more speculation. Jacob waited until the writer had left before opening it. His hands shook as he unfolded the single page, recognizing Abigail's neat handwriting immediately. "Dear Jacob," it began, and his heart clenched at the formality. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few days. Catherine believes I'm being foolish, that I'm confusing gratitude and loneliness with love. She might be right. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that I can't stop thinking about Emma, about you, about the life we almost had for 3 beautiful, impossible weeks." Jacob's throat tightened. He read on. "You asked me to come home, and part of me wants nothing more. But I'm scared, Jacob. Scared of making a mistake that will hurt all 3 of us. Scared of dishonoring Thomas and Sarah. Scared of what people will say, what Emma will face growing up. But most of all, I'm scared that if I don't take this chance, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." His pulse quickened. "I need to know something first. I need to know that you're certain, truly certain, that this is what you want. Not because Emma needs feeding, not because you're lonely, but because you genuinely believe we could build something real together. If you are, then meet me. There's a place Sarah and I used to visit about 3 miles north of Iron Ridge, a meadow with a single oak tree in the middle. She talked about it often, said it was where she felt closest to peace. If you can meet me there tomorrow at noon, alone, we'll talk. Really talk. Without sisters or babies or distractions. And then we'll decide together what comes next." The letter was signed simply Abigail, but at the bottom she'd added a postscript. "I'm trusting you to know where I mean. If you don't, then maybe we don't know each other well enough after all." Jacob's mind raced. A meadow with an oak tree, 3 miles north. Sarah had mentioned it, not often, but enough. She'd called it her thinking place, had ridden there sometimes when she needed solitude. Jacob had been there once, maybe twice, early in their marriage. He could find it again. The fact that Abigail knew about it, that Sarah had shared that private place with her during their conversations, felt significant. Like Sarah was somehow giving her blessing from beyond the grave. Jacob looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. He couldn't take her with him. Abigail had been clear about that. But he couldn't leave her alone either, not for the hours it would take to ride to the meadow and back. He made a decision he'd been avoiding for weeks. He rode to the Henderson Ranch 8 miles south and asked Margaret Henderson if she'd watch Emma for a few hours the next day. Margaret was a kind woman in her 50s who'd raised 6 children of her own. She took one look at Jacob's face and agreed without asking questions, though curiosity flickered in her eyes. That night, Jacob barely slept. He kept rehearsing what he'd say to Abigail, how he'd convince her that what they had was real and worth fighting for. But every speech he crafted in his head sounded inadequate, unable to capture the complexity of what he felt. How did you explain that loving someone new didn't diminish loving someone lost? That grief and hope could coexist? That sometimes the only way forward was through the scandal, not around it? Morning came too slowly and too fast. Jacob fed Emma, changed her, dressed her in her warmest clothes. Then he bundled her up and rode to the Hendersons, arriving just before 10. "You look like a man heading to his own hanging," Margaret observed as she took Emma. "Should I be worried?" "Maybe," Jacob admitted. "Or maybe I'm heading toward the best decision of my life. I honestly don't know which." Margaret smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "The best decisions usually feel that way. Go on. Emma will be fine with me." The ride north seemed to take forever. Jacob followed the creek that ran through his property, then veered west toward the low hills where Sarah used to ride.
The meadow was harder to find than he remembered. Winter had transformed the landscape, making familiar landmarks strange. But eventually he crested a rise, and there it was, a wide expanse of snow-covered ground with a massive oak tree standing sentinel in the center, its bare branches reaching toward the pale sky like prayers. And beneath the tree, wrapped in a dark cloak and standing beside a horse, was Abigail. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs as he rode down into the meadow. Abigail watched him approach, her expression unreadable. When he dismounted, they stood facing each other across 6 feet of snow, neither quite willing to close the distance first. "You found it," Abigail said finally. "Sarah loved this place. Used to say it was where she could hear herself think." "She told me about it once," Abigail said. "When we were talking about loss, about finding peace. She said sometimes she'd ride out here and talk to God, demand answers for why life was so hard. Said he never answered, but somehow she always felt better anyway." Jacob smiled despite the ache in his chest. "That sounds like Sarah." They fell into silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. The wind whistled through the oak's bare branches. In the distance, a hawk cried out, hunting. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Abigail said finally. "About what it would mean to marry you, to become Emma's mother, to build a life together." Jacob's throat was too tight to speak. He just nodded, waiting. "Catherine thinks I'm insane. She's probably right." Abigail wrapped her cloak tighter around herself. "But Jacob, I can't stop thinking about the 3 weeks I spent at Iron Ridge. About how, for the first time since Thomas died, I felt like I had a purpose. Like maybe my life wasn't over after all." "It's not over," Jacob said hoarsely. "Abigail, you're 26 years old. You have so much life ahead of you." "I know, but I don't want to live it without Emma. Without you." She took a step closer. "That's what terrifies me most. Not what people will say, not the scandal, not even whether it's too soon. I'm terrified because I know in my bones that if I walk away now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Jacob closed the remaining distance between them in 3 long strides. "Then don't walk away. Stay. Marry me. Let's build something together out of all this grief and loss." "But what about Sarah?" Abigail's eyes were brimming with tears. "What about Thomas? Don't we owe them?" "We owe them happiness," Jacob interrupted firmly. "We owe them the promise to keep living, to find joy again, to not let their deaths destroy us completely. Abigail, Sarah would have liked you. She would have understood this. She was practical that way. She'd want Emma cared for. She'd want me to move forward. She'd want our daughter to have a mother." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I knew her. For 7 years I knew her better than I knew myself. And I'm telling you, she'd give us her blessing." Abigail reached up and touched Jacob's face, her cold fingers gentle against his bearded cheek. "What about Thomas? Do you think he'd understand? That his mother found love again?" "I think Thomas would want his mother to be happy," Jacob said. "I think any child would want that." Abigail let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. "We're really doing this, aren't we? We're actually going to get married and face down the entire town and raise Emma together." "If you'll have me," Jacob said. Then, because the moment seemed to require it, he dropped to one knee in the snow. "Abigail Rowe, will you marry me? Will you be Emma's mother and my wife and my partner in whatever comes next?" Abigail looked down at him, tears streaming freely now, and for a heart-stopping moment Jacob thought she might say no, might turn and ride away, choosing safety and propriety over the messy uncertainty of what they could build together. But then she smiled, really smiled, bright and genuine and full of hope. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jacob. I'll marry you." Jacob surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while she cried against his chest. She was solid and real, and here, choosing him, choosing Emma, choosing a future that wouldn't be easy but would be theirs. "When?" he asked when she'd calmed enough to pull back slightly. "How soon can we do this?" Abigail laughed, a watery sound. "Eager?" "Terrified you'll change your mind." "I won't," she said with more certainty than she'd shown yet. "But Jacob, we need to do this right. Not run off and elope like we're ashamed. We stand up in front of the town and do it properly, show them we're not hiding. That's going to make things harder." "I know,
but we owe it to Emma to give her a legitimate start.
To make sure no one can ever question whether she's really ours. Jacob understood what she meant. The scandal of their swift courtship would follow them regardless. But if they married properly, legally, publicly, at least Emma would be protected. She'd be Abigail's daughter in the eyes of the law and the church, not just in their hearts. All right, he agreed, we do it publicly, but soon, I don't want to wait months, Egg. A month, Abigail said. Give people time to adjust to the idea, to see that we're serious, and give us time to be sure. I'm already sure. I know. But we've been apart less than 2 weeks. Let's court properly. Let people see us together. Let them understand this isn't some hasty mistake born of desperation. She cupped his face in both hands. I want to marry you, Jacob, but I want to do it in a way we won't regret. He understood the wisdom in her words, even if he didn't like them, so he agreed. 1 month of courtship. 1 month of letting the town see them together, judge them, whisper about them. 1 month of proving that what they had was real. And then they'd marry. Scandal be damned. They talked for another hour beneath Sarah's oak tree, making plans, discussing logistics, figuring out how to navigate the complicated waters ahead. Abigail would move back to Iron Ridge in a week. Not into the cabin, not yet, but to a small cabin on the property that had once housed a ranch hand. Close enough to help with Emma, far enough to preserve some semblance of propriety. Jacob would speak to Pastor Williams about marrying them, would face down whatever judgment came from the church council. They'd invite the whole town to the wedding, make it clear they had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. It wouldn't be easy. People would talk. Some would refuse to attend, would shun them both. But others, the ones who mattered, would understand. Would see a man and woman trying to build something good from tragedy, trying to give an orphaned baby the mother she needed. When they finally rode back toward town together, Jacob felt lighter than he had in months. The future was uncertain, the path ahead rocky and full of obstacles. But Abigail rode beside him, her face turned toward the winter sun, and that was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and gossip and grudging acceptance. News of their engagement spread through Sage Hollow like wildfire, sparking outrage in some quarters and surprising support in others. Mrs. Henderson spoke up for them, telling anyone who'd listen that Emma needed a mother and Jacob deserved happiness. Doc Morrison, who delivered Emma and treated Sarah in her final days, publicly stated that the arrangement was practical and kind, not scandalous. But others weren't so understanding. The church council called a special meeting to discuss whether Pastor Williams should perform the ceremony. Some members argued it was too soon, that Jacob was dishonoring Sarah's memory, but the pastor himself shut down that talk. Sarah Hollis was a practical woman who loved her daughter more than anything, he said firmly. If she were here, she'd want Emma cared for properly. She'd want Jacob to find happiness again. Who are we to stand in judgment of 2 people trying to heal? The vote passed, narrowly, and the wedding was set for the last Saturday in January. Abigail moved into the ranch hand's cabin as planned, small and drafty, but adequate. She spent her days caring for Emma while Jacob worked, and slowly the 3 of them fell into a new rhythm. Different from before, more careful and proper, but still fundamentally right. Emma thrived under Abigail's care, growing plumper by the day, her smiles more frequent. She'd started making cooing sounds that might someday become words, reaching for objects with increasing coordination, and whenever Abigail picked her up, the baby's whole face lit with recognition and joy. In the evenings, Jacob and Abigail sat in the main cabin with Emma between them, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other properly now, without the urgency of crisis driving them. Abigail told stories about growing up with 6 siblings, about teaching school alongside her mother, about falling in love with her husband at a church picnic. Jacob shared memories of building the ranch, of his parents back in Missouri, of the dreams he'd harbored before life got complicated. And sometimes, carefully, they talked about Sarah and Thomas, keeping their memories alive, refusing to let grief turn into silence. It hurt, but it was a good hurt, the kind that meant healing was happening. The night before the wedding, Jacob stood in the bedroom he'd shared with Sarah, looking at the space where her things had been. He'd given most of her clothes to Abigail by now, had slowly cleared out the reminders that were too painful to keep, but he'd saved a few things. Her wedding ring, a lock of her hair, the Bible her grandmother had given her. These he placed carefully in a small wooden box he'd carved, then set the box on a high shelf where Emma could have it someday when she was old enough to understand. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," he said to the empty room, to Sarah's ghost, to whatever remained of the woman he'd loved. "I hope you understand. I hope you'd approve." The room offered no response, but somehow Jacob felt at peace. Sarah was gone, truly gone, and no amount of guilt or waiting would bring her back. But Abigail was here, alive and real, and willing to build a future with him. And that was a gift he didn't intend to squander. The wedding took place on a bright, brutally cold Saturday afternoon. About half the town showed up, more than Jacob had expected, fewer than a traditional wedding would have drawn. They gathered in the small church, their faces a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and genuine goodwill. Abigail walked down the aisle alone, carrying Emma against her shoulder. She'd insisted on this, wanted the town to see that this wedding was about creating a family, not just joining two lonely people. She wore a simple dress, pale blue instead of white, and her hair was pinned up simply. She looked beautiful and terrified and determined all at once. Jacob waited at the altar, his hands shaking despite his best efforts to appear calm. When Abigail reached him and he saw Emma nestled contentedly in her arms, his daughter looking healthy and happy and loved, his eyes filled with tears. Pastor Williams kept the ceremony short and simple. There were no elaborate vows, no lengthy speeches about the sanctity of marriage, just the basics. Do you take this woman? Do you take this man? In sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death parts you. They both said yes. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Abigail gently, aware of every eye in the church watching them, judging them, and not caring at all. Emma made a small sound of protest at being squished between them, and they broke apart laughing. The reception was small, held in the church hall with food donated by those who supported them. It wasn't fancy, nothing like the elaborate celebration Jacob and Sarah had enjoyed 7 years ago, but it was real and honest. And as Jacob watched Abigail laugh at something Mrs. Henderson said while bouncing Emma on her hip, he felt something he hadn't felt in months: joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. They rode back to Iron Ridge that evening as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. Abigail sat beside Jacob on the wagon seat, Emma bundled between them, and they didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying. When they reached the ranch, Jacob carried their things inside while Abigail tended to Emma. The cabin felt different now, no longer haunted by loss, but filled with possibility. Abigail moved through it like she belonged there, because she did. This was her home now, their home. That night, after Emma had been fed and put to bed in the cradle, Jacob had moved into the main bedroom. Jacob and Abigail stood together by the window looking out at the stars. "Are you scared?" Abigail asked quietly. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "You?" "Petrified." She laughed softly. "But also hopeful. Is that strange?" "No, I think that's exactly right." Jacob pulled her close, and she came willingly, fitting against his side like she'd been made for that space. "We're going to make mistakes. Probably lots of them." "Definitely lots of them," Abigail agreed. "But we'll figure it out together." "Together," she echoed. Then, softer, "Thank you, Jacob, for not giving up on us, for fighting for this. Thank you for saying yes, for being brave enough to choose us." They stood like that for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to Emma's soft breathing from the bedroom, feeling the warmth of the fire at their backs. Two broken people who'd found each other in a storm, who'd chosen healing over grief, hope over fear, love over loneliness. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. It wasn't proper or conventional or easy, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. The months that followed weren't without challenges. Some people in Sage Hollow never fully accepted their union, continued to whisper about the indecent haste, the impropriety of it all. But gradually, as the scandal faded and people saw how devoted Abigail was to Emma, how carefully Jacob and Abigail were building their life together, even the skeptics began to soften. Emma celebrated her first birthday in December with both her parents present. She took her first steps in January, stumbling between Jacob's outstretched arms and Abigail's. Her first word was "Mama,"
spoken while looking directly at Abigail. And if Jacob noticed the tears in his wife's eyes, he said nothing about them. Just held her tight that night and whispered that she was a wonderful mother, that Emma was lucky to have her. In February, Abigail discovered she was pregnant. The news sent them both into a tailspin of emotions, joy and fear and guilt all tangled together. A new baby felt like both a blessing and a betrayal, another complication in their already complicated life. But as Abigail's belly grew and Emma learned to say baby, excitement began to overtake the other emotions. This child would be theirs together, not replacement for what they'd lost, but addition to what they were building. Jacob's son was born in October, 3 years after the night Abigail had knocked on his door during the blizzard. They named him Thomas James Hollis. Thomas for Abigail's lost boy, James for Jacob's middle name. Emma adored her baby brother immediately, insisting on helping with everything despite being too young to be much actual help. And Abigail, holding her newborn son while watching Emma dance around the cabin singing nonsense songs, felt the last piece of her shattered heart click back into place. 2 years after that, they had another daughter, Sarah Margaret, named for both grandmothers, a squalling bundle of determination who kept them all on their toes from day one. The ranch prospered. Jacob expanded operations, bought neighboring land, built additional structures. Iron Ridge became known as one of the most successful ranches in the territory, and the Hollis family is one of the most solid despite their scandalous beginning. On a spring afternoon when Emma was 7, the family took a ride out to the meadow with the oak tree. It had become their tradition. Every year on the anniversary of Jacob and Abigail's engagement, they'd ride out together and have a picnic under Sarah's tree. Emma ran ahead with Thomas, both children shrieking with laughter as they chased each other through the new grass. Baby Sarah slept in Abigail's arms, content and peaceful. Jacob and Abigail walked slowly, hand in hand, watching their children play. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked. It was a question he had asked before, probably would ask again. Choosing this life? Choosing us? Abigail didn't answer immediately. She watched Emma help Thomas climb a low branch of the oak tree, her face thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd never gotten lost in that storm," she said finally. "If I'd made it to Catherine's boarding house, grieved properly, eventually moved on in whatever way was expected, maybe remarried eventually, had more children, lived a respectable, unremarkable life." Jacob's chest tightened, but he waited. "But then I look at Emma, at Thomas, at baby Sarah, at you, and I realize this is the life I was meant to have. Not the one I planned with my first husband, not the conventional life Catherine wanted for me. This one, messy and complicated and born from grief and desperation and the kind of love that doesn't follow rules." She turned to look at Jacob, her eyes bright. "So no, I don't regret it. Not for a single moment." Jacob pulled her close, careful not to squish the baby between them, and pressed a kiss to her temple. "Good, because I plan to keep you for a very long time." "Forever," Abigail corrected. "You're stuck with me forever, Jacob Hollis." "Promise?" "Promise." From the oak tree, Emma called out, "Mama, Papa, come see how high I can climb." "Coming, sweetheart," Abigail called back. Then to Jacob, "Our daughter's going to give us gray hair before we're 40. "Which daughter?" Jacob asked dryly. "We have 3 potential sources of gray hair now." Abigail laughed, the sound bright and free and filled with the kind of joy that only comes from choosing happiness despite everything. They walked toward the oak tree together, toward their children, toward the future they'd built from the wreckage of their pasts. The tree stood strong and solid, just as it had the day Sarah used to visit it, just as it had the day Jacob and Abigail had pledged their future to each other beneath its branches. It had weathered storms and seasons, loss and renewal, death and rebirth. Just like them. Years later, when Emma was grown and married herself, she'd bring her own children to the meadow and tell them the story of how their grandparents met, about the blizzard and the desperate father and the grieving mother who'd saved a dying baby with the milk intended for her own lost child, about how love could grow from tragedy, how families could be built from broken pieces, how sometimes the most scandalous choices were also the right ones. And her children would listen, wide-eyed, and ask if it was really true. Emma would smile and say yes, every word of it,
She'd tell them about growing up with parents who'd chosen each other against all odds, who'd faced down judgment and built something beautiful from grief. She'd tell them that she remembered the woman who'd given her life twice, once by nursing her when she was starving, again by choosing to be her mother when she could have walked away. And then she'd take them to visit the two graves on the hillside overlooking the ranch, Sarah Hollis on the left, her stone reading "Beloved Wife and Mother," and next to her, many years later, Abigail Hollis, beloved wife and mother who chose love over fear. Between the two stones, planted years ago by Jacob himself, stood a young white fir tree. Stubborn and strong, growing despite the harsh Wyoming weather, its branches reaching toward the sky like prayer, like hope, like family. The tree Jacob had planted the summer after Thomas was born, when Abigail had watched with tears in her eyes and said, "It's stubborn, like us." And Jacob had smiled and replied, "Then it'll stand forever." He'd been right. The tree still stood, would stand long after all of them were gone, a living testament to the family that had grown from desperate circumstances, from grief transformed into love, from a knock on the door during a blizzard that had changed 3 lives forever. Some stories end in tragedy, some end in triumph. This one ended in something more complicated and more beautiful, in survival, in growth, in the stubborn determination to build joy from sorrow and family from strangers, in a white fir tree that refused to fall, no matter how hard the wind blew, in a love that had survived scandal and judgment and grief itself, in a ranch called Iron Ridge, where 3 broken people had found each other in the storm and built something strong enough to last forever.